For most of human history, waking up meant continuity, the same landscape, the same patterns of light, the same rhythms of cold and warmth. Change, when it came, usually moved slowly enough for the human body to adjust, step by step, generation by generation. But there was a moment when that pattern appears to have broken, not gradually, not over many lifetimes, but within a span short enough to be felt. A world that had been warming began to cool again. Water shifted, winds changed, and environments that once supported life became uncertain. The human body, shaped over hundreds of thousands of years to track stability in its surroundings, suddenly faced conditions it had not prepared for. Before we begin, consider this quietly. What happens when the world changes faster than the human body can adapt? And how did humans 12,800 years ago wake up to a world that suddenly froze? For a long stretch of time before this moment, the world had been changing in a direction that, for humans, made a certain kind of sense. Ice sheets that once covered vast regions were retreating. Temperatures were rising slowly, not in sudden jumps, but in patterns that allowed landscapes to reorganize themselves. Water began to flow differently. Plants expanded into areas that had once been too cold, and animals followed these shifts in ways that could be observed, remembered, and gradually understood. Human groups, small and mobile, did not control these changes, but they lived within them. Their survival depended on recognizing patterns that repeated often enough to be trusted. The body itself, through hunger, fatigue, and the need for warmth, acted as a constant guide, shaped over hundreds of thousands of years to read an environment that, while never static, rarely changed beyond recognition within a single lifetime. What mattered was not stability in the absolute sense, but stability in rhythm. Days followed nights, seasons followed one another, and even larger climate shifts unfolded slowly enough that knowledge could accumulate across generations. In this sense, the human body was not built to predict the future in detail, but to respond to a world that changed at a pace it could keep up with. As the end of the last ice age approached, this relationship between body and environment appeared, for a time, to be moving toward a new balance. Warmer conditions meant different kinds of plant life, more varied food sources in some regions, and a redistribution of animals across landscapes that had once been constrained by cold. For human groups, this did not mean ease, but it did mean a form of continuity. The signals the body relied on, temperature, daylight, availability of food, still corresponded to patterns that could be learned. A cold season was followed by a warmer one, scarcity by relative abundance, and movement across the land followed routes that had meaning because they had been repeated before. This is the kind of world the human nervous system expects. Not a world without hardship, but a world where hardship is patterned. Even in challenging conditions, the body can prepare, conserve energy, and adjust behavior when the environment behaves in ways that are at least partly predictable. The importance of this cannot be overstated, because human survival has always depended less on strength or speed, and more on the ability to anticipate. To know when to move, when to stay, when to hunt, and when to conserve energy is not a conscious calculation in the modern sense, but a layered response built into physiology and reinforced by shared experience. Over long periods of time, these responses become reliable because the environment itself provides consistent feedback. But this reliability rests on an assumption that is rarely questioned, that the future will resemble the recent past closely enough for past experience to remain useful. Around the time when the planet seemed to be emerging from the grip of extensive ice, this assumption began to weaken, not all at once, and not in the same way everywhere, but enough that the underlying rhythm of the environment started to shift. The warming that had been unfolding did not simply continue in a straight line. Instead, there is evidence that conditions reversed, bringing colder temperatures back into regions that had begun to adjust to warmth. For a human group living within such a landscape, the change would not have been experienced as a global event, but as a series of disruptions. A place that once supported certain plants might no longer do so. Animal movements could become less predictable. Water sources might behave differently, freezing earlier or remaining scarce for longer periods. The body, which depends on regular cues to regulate energy use, would encounter signals that no longer aligned with expectation. Hunger might arrive earlier or last longer, Cold might persist beyond the point where stored resources were sufficient. Movement, which had once followed known paths, could become uncertain as familiar locations no longer offered the same conditions. This is the beginning of a subtle but important shift. The environment is no longer just difficult, it is unfamiliar in its behavior. And for a species whose survival depends on the ability to read and respond to patterns, unfamiliarity introduces a different kind of challenge. It is not simply a matter of enduring cold or scarcity, but of facing a world where the cues that once guided survival no longer lead to reliable outcomes. The body continues to respond as it always has, but the world it responds to is no longer behaving in the same way. The difficulty in recognizing such a shift is that it does not arrive as a single moment that can be clearly identified. There is no boundary where one day belongs to a stable world and the next belongs to a different one. Instead, the change emerges through small inconsistencies, patterns that no longer repeat as expected, and signals that seem slightly out of place. A season might arrive later than before, or linger longer than memory would suggest. A familiar stretch of land might still exist in form, but no longer function in the same way. For a human group relying on accumulated experience, these differences are not immediately understood as part of a larger transformation. They appear first as local problems, temporary disruptions that can perhaps be managed by adjusting movement or waiting for conditions to return to what they were. This is an important aspect of how the human body and mind respond to environmental change. They are not designed to assume that the world has fundamentally altered itself at once. Instead, they operate on the expectation that irregularities will correct themselves, because for most of human history they did. But when irregularities persist, and when they begin to connect across different aspects of the environment, a deeper instability begins to emerge. The body experiences this not as a concept, but as a series of pressures. Hunger that does not resolve in the usual time frame, cold that remains even when the season should be shifting, fatigue that accumulates because movement becomes less efficient, as routes that once led to food or shelter no longer do so reliably. These are not abstract signals. They are direct, physical experiences that shape behavior moment by moment. Over long periods of stability, the body learns to trust its own responses because they are reinforced by outcomes that align with expectation. When that alignment begins to break, the same responses may no longer lead to survival in the same way. Moving toward a known location may result in less food than before. Waiting for a seasonal change may no longer bring relief. Conserving energy in one context might lead to greater risk in another. In this way, the relationship between body and environment becomes strained. The body continues to operate according to patterns shaped by past conditions, but the environment is no longer providing the feedback that confirms those patterns. This creates a form of uncertainty that is different from simple scarcity. Scarcity, when it follows a known rhythm, can be prepared for. Uncertainty, when it disrupts that rhythm, makes preparation itself less reliable. For human groups at the time, this would have affected not just individual survival, but the shared knowledge that binds a group together. Knowledge of where to go, when to move, and how to respond to changing conditions is not held by one individual alone. It is distributed across the group, reinforced through repeated success. When the environment changes in ways that invalidate this knowledge, the group must adjust, but adjustment takes time. It requires new experiences to accumulate, new patterns to be recognized, and new strategies to be tested. During this period, the cost of error increases. A decision that once would have been safe may now carry greater risk. The margin between survival and failure narrows. This is where the scale of environmental change begins to intersect directly with the limits of the human body. The body can endure cold, but only to a point, and only with sufficient energy intake. It can tolerate hunger, but only for a limited duration before function declines. It can adapt behaviorally by moving across landscapes, but movement itself requires energy, and energy depends on the availability of resources that are becoming less predictable. The balance between these factors is delicate. When one part shifts, the others must compensate, but compensation is not always possible if the underlying conditions continue to change. Around this time, the broader pattern of warming that had defined the end of the Ice Age appears to have been interrupted. Rather than continuing toward greater warmth, conditions in many regions shifted back toward colder states. This shift is often discussed in terms of large-scale climate systems, but for the people living through it, the experience would have been immediate and local. It would have been felt in the ground, in the air, in the availability of food, and in the increasing difficulty of maintaining familiar ways of life. The body does not perceive climate in abstract terms. It perceives it through the effort required to maintain warmth, the energy needed to move, and the success or failure of attempts to find food. When these efforts begin to yield different results than before, the body registers a change even if the cause is not understood. What emerges from this is not a single dramatic event, but a gradual realization, expressed through repeated experience, that the world is no longer behaving as it once did. And when that realization takes hold, even without being named, it alters the way humans must interact with their environment, because the assumption of continuity has been quietly broken. What makes this moment difficult to grasp is that, even as conditions begin to shift, there is no immediate language for what is happening. There is no way to step outside the environment and observe it as a system. Everything is experienced from within the limits of the body. Cold is not an abstract trend, but a sensation that lingers longer than expected. Hunger is not a statistic, but a recurring pressure that does not resolve in familiar ways. Movement is not a map, but a sequence of decisions made under uncertainty, each one shaped by the memory of what once worked. In a world where patterns have long guided survival, the early stages of disruption are almost invisible because they resemble the kinds of variation that have always existed. A colder season can be endured. A failed hunt can be followed by another. A less productive area can be abandoned for a different one. These responses are built into the human way of living. They rely on the assumption that somewhere within reach, the expected pattern will still hold. But when the disruption extends across multiple aspects of the environment at once, this assumption becomes harder to maintain. It is not only that one place becomes less reliable, but that several places begin to change in ways that do not align with past experience. The body responds by increasing effort. More movement, more searching, more attempts to find what has become less predictable. Yet increased effort comes with a cost. Energy spent in movement must be replaced by energy from food, and when food is uncertain, the margin for error narrows. The body begins to operate closer to its limits, not because it is incapable, but because the conditions it was adapted to are no longer fully present. Over long stretches of human history, these limits have rarely been tested in the same way across entire regions at once. Local hardship could often be avoided by moving elsewhere, by following animals, or by shifting patterns of activity. But when environmental changes extend across broader areas, movement itself becomes less effective as a solution. The landscape offers fewer reliable alternatives. In this situation, the body's usual strategies, anticipation, adjustment, conservation, are still applied, but they produce less certain outcomes. This creates a form of strain that is cumulative rather than immediate. There may be no single moment where survival becomes impossible, but there is a gradual tightening of conditions where each decision carries more weight and each mistake has greater consequences. Within small groups, this strain is shared. Decisions about where to go and when to move are not isolated choices. They affect everyone, and they depend on knowledge that may no longer be fully reliable. The past continues to guide action, but its guidance weakens as the environment diverges from what that past describes. This is where the relationship between memory and survival begins to shift. Memory, in the sense of accumulated experience, has always been one of the most powerful tools humans possess. It allows patterns to be recognized, risks to be anticipated, and resources to be found with greater efficiency. But memory depends on continuity. It depends on the world behaving in ways that resemble what has already been learned. When that continuity is disrupted, memory does not disappear, but its usefulness changes. It becomes less certain, less able to predict outcomes with confidence. For a human body that relies on anticipation to regulate effort, this uncertainty is not neutral. It increases the cost of living. More time must be spent searching, more energy must be invested without guaranteed return, and more exposure to cold and scarcity becomes unavoidable. In this way, the shift in climate is not experienced as a distant event, but as a change in the balance between effort and reward. The body continues to act, to move, to seek, but the results of these actions become less consistent. Over time, this inconsistency accumulates into a different kind of environment, one where survival is no longer supported by familiar rhythms, but must be renegotiated continuously. And it is within this gradual, often unnoticed transition that the deeper impact of the change begins to take hold, not as a single shock, but as a persistent alteration in how the human body relates to the world around it. If the earlier changes could be mistaken for irregularities within a familiar system, this next phase becomes harder to interpret in that way. The pattern of gradual warming that had shaped the end of the Ice Age does not simply pause. In many regions, it appears to reverse. Conditions shift toward colder states again, not necessarily in a single uniform direction everywhere, but with enough consistency that the overall trajectory no longer aligns with what had been unfolding. This shift is often associated with what researchers describe as the Younger Dryas, a period marked by a return to cooler conditions after a phase of warming. The exact causes remain a subject of study, and different explanations have been proposed, ranging from changes in ocean circulation to disruptions in freshwater systems. What matters here is not to fix on a single cause, but to recognize the effect. A climate system that had been moving toward warmth begins to behave differently, and this difference unfolds on a timescale that is short relative to the long processes that usually shape the environment. For human groups living within these changing conditions, the experience would not have been one of understanding a global climate shift. There would have been no sense of a named period or a defined event. Instead, the change would have been encountered through repeated exposure to colder conditions that did not resolve as expected. The body, which regulates itself through a balance between energy intake and energy expenditure, would begin to register a mismatch. Maintaining warmth requires energy, and when temperatures drop or remain low for longer durations, the demand for energy increases. If this increased demand is not matched by a corresponding increase in available food, the body must compensate by drawing on stored reserves or by reducing activity. But reducing activity is not always an option when food must be actively sought, especially in environments where resources are becoming less predictable. This creates a tension between the need to conserve energy and the need to expend it. Over time, such tension places the body in a more fragile state, where resilience depends on a narrow balance that can be disrupted by further environmental variability. The return of colder conditions would also have influenced the structure of the landscape itself. Water sources may have frozen earlier or remained inaccessible for longer periods. Plant growth cycles could have shifted, reducing the availability of certain foods at times when they had previously been expected. Animals, responding to the same environmental pressures, may have altered their movement patterns, becoming harder to locate or less predictable in their behavior. For human groups that depended on tracking these patterns, such changes would have required constant adjustment. Yet adjustment is not instantaneous. It depends on repeated observation and the gradual formation of new expectations. During the period in which old expectations no longer hold and new ones have not yet stabilized, uncertainty becomes a defining feature of daily life. This uncertainty is experienced through the body, not as an abstract concept, but as a sequence of efforts that do not always lead to the outcomes they once did. Searching for food may take longer, exposure to cold may be more frequent, rest may be interrupted by the need to move, or by the difficulty of maintaining warmth. These are small experiences when taken individually, but together they alter the rhythm of life in ways that accumulate. The human body is capable of enduring significant stress, but its capacity is not unlimited. It relies on cycles of exertion and recovery, on periods of scarcity followed by periods of replenishment. When colder conditions extend the duration of scarcity or compress the opportunities for replenishment, these cycles become strained. The body may continue to function, but it does so with reduced margin for error. In such a context, even minor additional challenges can have greater consequences. A failed attempt to find food, a period of illness, or a delay in movement can have effects that extend beyond the immediate moment. This is how a broader environmental shift translates into lived experience. It does not appear as a single overwhelming force, but as a series of adjustments that become more difficult to manage over time. The cooling that marks this period is therefore not just a change in temperature, but a change in the conditions under which human life must operate. It alters the balance between effort and reward, between expectation and outcome, and between the body's needs and the environment's ability to meet them. And because this shift unfolds relatively quickly compared to the deep timescales of human evolution, it challenges a system that is built to adapt gradually, not to recalibrate all at once. A climate shift becomes truly dangerous for humans not only when it is severe, but when it arrives faster than habits can be rebuilt. A colder world is not automatically unlivable. Human beings had already survived long periods of cold before this. The problem is that the cold associated with this period seems to have returned after environments had already begun adjusting in another direction. In other words, people were not facing a frozen world that had always behaved the same way. They were facing a world that had started to open, soften, and reorganize, and then changed course again. That reversal matters because the human body does not adapt to temperature alone. It adapts to patterns. It learns, over repeated seasons, how much effort is needed to stay warm, how long food remains available, how far movement must extend, and when certain risks usually begin. When those patterns are interrupted, the body is forced into a more reactive state. It can still endure, but it endures with less certainty. This is one reason the return of colder conditions may have been so disruptive. The issue was not simply that it became cold. The issue was that the environmental rhythm guiding daily life became harder to trust. A spring that once brought recovery might arrive weakly or late. A route that once connected shelter, water, and food might no longer do so with the same reliability. What had been learned through repeated success could begin to fail in quiet but costly ways. For small human groups, such failures would not remain theoretical for long. They would appear in the body as longer periods of energy deficit, in movement as wider search ranges, and in group life as more pressure placed on every decision about where to stay and when to leave. The body's needs remain constant even when the world becomes unstable. It still needs warmth, water, rest, and calories. But when the environment becomes less predictable, meeting those needs takes more effort. That extra effort creates a hidden cost. It reduces flexibility. A group with limited reserves cannot experiment endlessly. It cannot keep making long journeys without consequence. It cannot afford repeated errors in timing. This is why speed matters so much in environmental change. If landscapes alter over many generations, knowledge can slowly adjust with them. Children grow into adults within a world already shaped by the new conditions. But when the pace is faster, one generation may carry expectations inherited from a previous environment into a new one that no longer rewards them in the same way. The body then becomes a place where that mismatch is felt directly. More cold stress means more energy spent on heat. More uncertainty means more movement. More movement without reliable return means deeper fatigue. These effects reinforce one another. A colder environment does not just demand warmth. It changes how long people can remain exposed, how much fuel their bodies must burn, how much time can be devoted to searching, and how narrow the line becomes between endurance and collapse. This is especially important in a species like ours, which survives not through specialized insulation or extreme physical power, but through flexible behavior supported by memory, cooperation, and planning. If memory becomes less reliable because the world is changing too quickly, then one of the human species' greatest strengths becomes temporarily weaker. Cooperation still matters, but cooperation alone cannot restore missing food or reverse a failed season. Planning still matters, but planning works best when patterns hold long enough to be recognized. In this sense, the colder phase often linked with the younger Dryas may be understood not only as a climatic event, but as a test of how far human flexibility could stretch before it reached its limits. The body did not stop being human. It continued doing what it had always done, conserving, moving, adjusting, enduring. But the world it was responding to had become less cooperative, less legible, and less stable than before. That is what turns environmental change into a human crisis. Not merely lower temperatures, but the breakdown of trust between organism and environment, between learned expectation and actual outcome, between the rhythm the body was shaped to follow and the one the world was now imposing. What makes this period especially difficult to understand is that even when scientists can see evidence of a large climatic reversal, the lived human experience of that reversal would still have unfolded in fragments. No one would have seen a chart, a timeline, or a global pattern. What people would have known was simpler and more immediate. The air stayed colder, the ground behaved differently, The expected return of easier conditions came more weakly, or not at all. The body notices these things before any larger interpretation becomes possible. It notices them in how long warmth can be held after sunset, in how much more effort a journey begins to require, and in how quickly hunger returns when food is scarce or less dependable. This is why a sudden climatic cooling must be understood not only as a change in weather, but as a change in the basic terms under which human bodies remained alive. A colder environment increases demand, but it also narrows options. People must spend more energy simply to maintain body temperature. They may need to travel farther for fuel, shelter, or food. They may have fewer periods in which movement is safe or efficient. These pressures do not arrive one at a time. They overlap, and because they overlap, they reduce the room humans normally have to recover from mistakes. In a more stable world, a poor decision could sometimes be corrected by the next day, the next movement, or the next seasonal shift. In a less stable world, the same poor decision might carry on into a longer chain of consequences. A failed search for food means not only a missed meal, but less energy for the next search. More exposure to cold means not only discomfort, but reduced strength, poorer rest, and a greater burden on the group as a whole. This is where the return of colder conditions becomes more than an environmental fact. It becomes a cumulative human problem. The human body evolved to be flexible, but flexibility does not mean freedom from limits. It means the ability to work within changing conditions up to a point. Beyond that point, the body cannot solve instability on its own. It can only absorb it, and absorption has costs. For small groups living close to the margin, those costs would have shaped daily behavior in quiet but powerful ways. Routes once chosen for familiarity may have become liabilities. Places once trusted for repeated use may have become uncertain. The body, which depends on rhythm to regulate effort, would now be forced into more constant vigilance. This matters because vigilance is expensive. It draws on energy, attention, and time. A life organized around predictable cycles can afford moments of lower alertness. A life organized around instability cannot do so as easily. The result is not just physical hardship, but a deep alteration in how humans inhabit space. They do not simply move through the land. They begin to test it more carefully, trust it less fully, and depend more heavily on short-term adjustment than on long-term expectation. In that sense, the event often associated with the younger Dryas may have confronted humans with something more unsettling than cold itself. It may have confronted them with a world that no longer kept its recent promises. The warming trend that seemed to be opening one future gave way to another condition entirely. Not every region changed in the same way, and not every group would have been affected equally, but the larger lesson remains. Human beings survive through a relationship with their environment that depends on repeated feedback. When the environment changes faster than that feedback can be relearned, the human body is forced into a more fragile mode of existence. It continues to function, to endure, to adapt where it can, but it does so without the same confidence that the next season will behave like the last. That loss of continuity may be one of the most important parts of this story. The cold matters. The environmental disruption matters. But what may matter most is that the world had ceased, for a time, to feel teachable in the old way. For most living creatures, survival depends not only on enduring the environment, but on learning its timing. Human beings are no different. Long before written records, before farming, before permanent settlements in most regions, people survived by detecting repetitions in the world around them. They learned where water could usually be found, when certain plants became available, when animals tended to pass through, and when cold would begin to tighten its hold on the land. This kind of learning is not separate from the body. It is part of how the body works. Hunger becomes meaningful when it can be linked to where food is usually found. Fatigue becomes manageable when movement follows known rhythms. Cold becomes survivable when the body and the group can prepare before it deepens. In this sense, memory is not only something stored in the mind. It is built into posture, pace, routes, and routines. It lives in when a group chooses to leave one place and how long it dares remain in another. This is why a rapidly changing environment creates a special kind of danger. It does not only remove resources, it interferes with the body's ability to use past experience as a guide. A person may still remember where food was found before, where shelter once worked, or when a season usually shifted, but that memory now leads into a world that responds differently. What had been a reliable pattern becomes only a possibility, and for human groups living close to the edge of energetic balance, the difference between a reliable pattern and a mere possibility is enormous. The body can withstand hardship when hardship is expected and paced. It can store energy when food is available. It can conserve heat when cold follows a familiar curve. It can rest when the risks of staying still are understood. But when the environment changes faster than memory can be updated, all of these calculations become less secure. More effort is required just to test whether old knowledge still works. A journey must still be made, but with less confidence in the outcome. Time must still be spent waiting, but with less certainty that waiting is wise. This produces a hidden strain on the body, because uncertainty itself consumes energy. Not in a mystical sense, but in a practical one. Uncertain environments force more trial and error. They demand more scanning, more movement, more caution, and more repeated decisions under pressure. For a species that depends heavily on flexibility, this might sound like a strength, and in many ways it is. Humans can alter behavior more easily than many other animals. They can cooperate, remember, improvise, and pass knowledge between generations. Yet this flexibility has a condition. It works best when the world changes slowly enough for new learning to accumulate before the old learning becomes dangerous. If change outruns that process, flexibility turns into constant adjustment, and constant adjustment has costs. The body must remain more alert. The group must tolerate more failed attempts. Children, older individuals, and anyone already weakened become more vulnerable because the environment is no longer supporting a dependable rhythm of recovery. What emerges from this is a simple but profound problem. Human survival depends not just on food, heat, and water in the abstract, but on the ability to anticipate where and when those things can be obtained. When anticipation weakens, survival becomes less efficient. More effort must be invested for less certainty of return. In a colder and increasingly unstable world, that imbalance would have mattered deeply. The people living through such a period were not only facing a harsher landscape, they were facing a landscape that had become harder to read. And because the human body is not merely a machine for enduring stress, but a system shaped to respond to pattern stress, the loss of reliable pattern may have been one of the most serious pressures of all. The world did not need to become completely unrecognizable to become dangerous. It only had to become unfamiliar quickly enough that memory could no longer keep pace. When memory loses precision, the body does not stop needing answers. It still has to decide when to move, when to stay, when to spend energy, and when to conserve it. This is where the pressure of a changing world becomes especially human. Many animals respond to shifting conditions through instinctive patterns that are tightly tied to specific habitats or seasons. Humans rely on something broader and more fragile. They rely on learned environments. A route across open ground is not just a line in space. It is a remembered sequence of water, shelter, exposure, and return. A valley is not simply a place. It is a stored expectation about what might be found there at a certain time of year. When those expectations begin to fail, the result is not immediate ignorance, but hesitation. The body enters a world where old knowledge still exists, yet no longer guarantees safety. That condition is difficult because it produces a gap between memory and outcome. A group may follow a known path and still arrive at a place that offers less than it once did. They may wait for a seasonal transition that had always brought relief, only to find that relief delayed or weakened. They may conserve resources on the assumption that the landscape will soon recover its familiar rhythm, but the rhythm no longer returns in the same form. This is how rapid environmental change reshapes human life without ever announcing itself. It does not need to erase the landscape. It only needs to weaken the connection between what is remembered and what is found. Once that connection weakens, the body begins to spend more of its life testing rather than trusting. That testing has a cost. It means longer searches, wider movement, more cautious decisions, and less efficient use of limited energy. A species that survives by flexibility can absorb some of this burden, but not without strain. Flexibility is often imagined as freedom, yet in harsh conditions it can become obligation. Humans must keep adjusting because they cannot rely on fur, thick fat stores, or highly specialized cold adaptations to protect them from every environmental shift. Their advantage lies in behavior, but behavior depends on information. When information becomes unstable, the body pays the price through effort. This would have been especially important for groups living through a renewed cooling after a period of relative warming. The environment was not simply hard, it was changing in ways that made prior learning less dependable. That means the body had to work harder not only against cold, but against uncertainty itself. Even rest becomes less complete in such a world, because rest depends on temporary security. To stop moving with confidence, a group must believe that where they are has enough shelter, enough food, enough continuity to justify stillness. If that belief weakens, movement becomes more frequent and more urgent. This matters because human energy is always limited. More movement requires more calories. More caution requires more time. More failed searches reduce the reserves needed for future decisions. The result is a feedback loop in which uncertainty creates greater expenditure, and greater expenditure reduces the margin available for coping with uncertainty. Over time, this kind of pressure can alter not only where humans go, but how they understand the land itself. Places once known through repetition become less stable in meaning. Familiarity no longer guarantees usefulness. The world becomes less of a remembered system and more of a shifting problem. For a creature whose success depends on turning experience into guidance, that is a profound loss. It does not mean humans suddenly become helpless. It means they are forced to live more reactively, with shorter horizons and less trust in the continuity of their surroundings. In that sense, a rapidly changing climate threatens one of the deepest foundations of human survival. It weakens the practical bond between body, memory, and place. And when that bond weakens, the challenge is not only to endure the cold, but to keep learning fast enough to remain alive inside a world that no longer behaves the way it recently did. There is a quiet turning point in this process, and it does not come from a single discovery or decision. It emerges slowly, as repeated experiences begin to contradict what had once been reliable. At first, a failed expectation can be explained away. A poor season, a temporary absence of animals, a patch of land that has become less productive, these things have always happened. But when such outcomes begin to repeat across different places and times, something deeper begins to shift. The body does not name this shift, but it responds to it. It becomes less willing to assume that what worked before will work again in the same way. This change in expectation is subtle, yet it carries consequences for every action that follows. Movement becomes more cautious, but also more necessary. Waiting becomes riskier, but still unavoidable. Each decision must be made with less confidence, and that uncertainty shapes how energy is used, how time is spent, and how far a group is willing to go in search of what it needs. This is where the loss of environmental memory turns into a different kind of condition. It is no longer just that the world has changed. It is that the body must now operate in a world where it cannot rely on the continuity of recent experience. In practical terms, this means that survival becomes more dependent on constant adjustment rather than on accumulated certainty. The body still uses what it has learned, but it must hold that knowledge more lightly, ready to abandon it when it no longer fits. This sounds like flexibility, but it also means instability. Without stable patterns, every gain is less secure. A place that provides food today may not do so tomorrow. A route that seems efficient may become costly without warning. The human body, which depends on cycles of effort and recovery, begins to lose some of the predictability that allows those cycles to function smoothly. Recovery depends on knowing when conditions will ease. If that easing becomes uncertain, rest itself becomes incomplete. Over time, this produces a quiet accumulation of strain, not always visible, not always immediate, but persistent. The body continues to endure, but it does so with less margin, less buffering against further disruption. Within small groups, this strain is shared, and it reshapes how people relate to one another. Decisions about movement, timing, and risk become more consequential because the environment no longer absorbs mistakes as easily as before. A decision that once would have had limited impact may now extend its effects over a longer period. This does not mean that every group responds in the same way, or that all outcomes are the same. Some groups may find ways to adjust more quickly, to shift routes, to discover new patterns that can be trusted again. Others may struggle longer with the mismatch between memory and environment. What matters is that the conditions for learning have changed. Learning is no longer reinforced by stable repetition, but by variation that must be interpreted carefully and often under pressure. In this sense, the environment has become not just colder, but more difficult to read. And for a species whose survival depends on reading the world accurately enough to act in time, that difficulty carries weight. The body cannot wait for certainty before it acts. It must act within uncertainty, drawing on partial information, testing outcomes, and adjusting continuously. This is a different mode of existence from one guided by familiar rhythms. It is more demanding, less forgiving, and more dependent on short-term feedback. Over time, this shift can alter how humans move through space, how they evaluate risk, and how they balance effort against reward. It does not erase the past, but it changes how the past can be used. The knowledge accumulated over generations remains present, yet its authority weakens in a world that no longer confirms it in the same way. This is the deeper effect of rapid environmental change. It does not only alter the external conditions of life, it alters the relationship between the human body and the patterns it depends on, turning what was once a guide into something that must constantly be questioned. When a climate shift interrupts the wider structure of a landscape, food does not disappear all at once. What changes first is reliability. A place that once offered a useful sequence of plants across the seasons may become thinner, slower, or less dependable. Areas that supported grazing animals may lose some of the vegetation those animals depended on. Wet ground may dry, or remain locked in cold longer than before. In this kind of world, the human problem is not simply hunger in the dramatic sense. It is the gradual breakdown of expectation. Human groups living before farming in most regions did not rely on a single food source, and that diversity gave them resilience. They could gather, hunt, fish where possible, and move when conditions required it. But resilience still depends on patterns. It depends on knowing that if one source becomes weak, another is likely to be available within reach and within the season. When colder conditions return and environmental rhythms become less stable, that network of substitutions becomes harder to trust. A body that once moved through the year by shifting among different foods now has to work harder to discover which options are still present, which have moved, and which have become too sparse to matter. This is where the food system begins to fail, not necessarily as total absence, but as fragmentation. What had once formed a usable chain of opportunities becomes broken into less predictable pieces. For the human body, that matters immediately. Calories are not merely fuel for action. They are what make warmth possible, what allow long movement across land, and what protect the body from sinking into deeper exhaustion. In colder conditions, energy demand rises even if activity stays the same. Yet activity rarely stays the same when food becomes harder to find. More distance must be covered. More time must be spent searching. More effort must be given to tasks that once required less. The body is then caught between two pressures at once. It must burn more energy to survive the cold, and also spend more energy to locate the food that replaces what it has burned. This is a dangerous balance because it reduces flexibility. A well-fed body can absorb delays, failed searches, and sudden stress more easily. A body living closer to deficit cannot do so for long without consequences. The return of colder and less stable conditions would also have changed the timing of availability. Even when food still existed in the landscape, it may not have appeared when it was expected, or it may have remained usable for a shorter period. This matters because human survival depends not only on what is present, but on when it can be reached and used. A plant that emerges too late, an animal that shifts route, or a frozen water edge that delays movement can alter the whole rhythm of subsistence. The body experiences these changes through uneven intake. There may still be food, but not in the right places, not at the right times, and not with the same regularity that recent memory had taught people to expect. Over time, this irregularity reshapes behavior. Groups may need to move sooner, wait less, spread effort across wider areas, or accept lower returns from places that once supported them better. None of this requires imagining dramatic collapse in every region. It only requires recognizing that small disruptions, repeated often enough, can make survival far more costly. For human beings, whose strength lies in flexible behavior rather than specialized physical adaptation to extreme cold, that cost would have been felt through the entire body. Hunger becomes sharper when effort no longer leads reliably to food. Cold becomes harder to bear when reserves are low. Fatigue becomes more dangerous when movement cannot stop. This is why the failure of food systems is so important in this story. It is not a separate issue from climate. It is the way climate enters the body, day after day, through the narrowing gap between what the body needs and what the land can still provide. As this loss of reliability deepens, the problem of food becomes less about locating a single successful hunt or gathering site, and more about maintaining a sequence that can sustain the body over time. Human survival depends on continuity. A single successful day cannot compensate for many uncertain ones if those uncertain days become more frequent. In a colder and less predictable environment, the intervals between successful foraging or hunting events may begin to stretch. Not always dramatically, and not in every place at once, but enough that the body can no longer rely on a steady rhythm of intake. This creates a condition where the timing of nourishment becomes uneven, and uneven timing is often more difficult for the body to manage than simple scarcity within a predictable pattern. The human body can adjust to periods of reduced intake if those periods follow a known cycle. It can conserve energy, reduce activity, and wait for the expected return of food. But when the return is uncertain, conservation becomes a risk. Waiting too long may lead to deeper depletion. Moving too early may expend energy without guarantee of success. This tension forces decisions that are made under pressure, where neither option is clearly safe. Over time, such conditions shift how groups approach the landscape. Instead of moving with confidence between known points, they may begin to explore more widely, revisiting places that have recently failed, testing new areas that have not yet been incorporated into memory, and adjusting routes more frequently. Each of these actions increases exposure. More movement means more time in cold conditions, more need for shelter, and more reliance on physical endurance. Yet endurance itself depends on the availability of food, which is precisely what has become unstable. This creates a cycle in which the effort required to secure food begins to undermine the body's ability to sustain that effort. The body becomes more dependent on immediate outcomes because it can no longer rely on stored reserves for as long. In such a state, even modest delays can have amplified effects. A day without sufficient intake may lead to reduced strength the following day, which in turn affects the ability to search effectively, creating a chain that is difficult to interrupt. Within a group, these effects are not evenly distributed. Some individuals may cope better than others, depending on age, health, and prior condition. But the group as a whole must respond to the weakest members, because survival is collective. If movement becomes too demanding, if food becomes too uncertain, or if cold exposure becomes too prolonged, the group must adjust its pace and decisions accordingly. This introduces another layer of complexity, because the optimal strategy for one individual may not be sustainable for the group. The need to remain together can limit the ability to move quickly or to take risks that might yield higher returns but also carry greater danger. In this way, the instability of food systems reshapes not only individual behavior, but social coordination. Decisions become more cautious, but also more constrained. There is less room for error, but also less room for experimentation. This matters because adaptation requires both caution and exploration. If the cost of exploration rises too high, the ability to discover new reliable patterns may slow down, prolonging the period of mismatch between body and environment. At the same time, the environment continues to change, not necessarily in a single direction, but in ways that make consistency harder to achieve. The body is then caught in a moving system, where each adjustment may only hold for a limited time. This is why the breakdown of food reliability can be more significant than a simple reduction in quantity. It undermines the sequence that allows the body to function smoothly. Without that sequence, hunger is not just a temporary state. It becomes a recurring uncertainty, shaping how energy is used, how risks are taken, and how far the body can be pushed before it begins to fail. Over time, this condition does not need to produce immediate collapse to have profound effects. It only needs to narrow the margin within which life can continue. And in a world where cold has returned and patterns have become less dependable, that margin becomes increasingly difficult to maintain. In such conditions, hunger changes from an occasional hardship into a background force that begins shaping nearly every other aspect of life. It is no longer only the feeling of not having enough to eat on a given day. It becomes a condition in which the body must repeatedly operate without confidence that the next effort will restore what has been lost. This matters because the human body is built to balance itself through cycles. It can spend energy and then recover. It can endure exposure and then restore warmth. It can move across difficult terrain and then pause long enough to rebuild strength. But when food becomes irregular in both place and timing, those cycles begin to weaken. Recovery becomes partial. Fatigue lingers. Cold penetrates more deeply because the body no longer has the same reserves to resist it. A person does not need to be starving in an extreme sense for this process to matter. Even a steady reduction in reliability can shift the body into a more fragile state, where every task costs more than before and returns less. That fragility would have shaped the entire structure of daily behavior. Movement could no longer be planned around expectation alone. It had to be planned around uncertainty. A known place might still be worth visiting, but it could no longer be trusted in the same way. A new place might offer opportunity, but reaching it required energy that might not be replaced quickly. This forces a different relationship with the landscape. The land is no longer a remembered sequence of dependable options. It becomes a field of probabilities, some stronger than others, none entirely secure. For human groups living through renewed cold, this would have made subsistence more mentally and physically demanding at the same time. The body had to keep functioning under stress, while the group had to keep interpreting incomplete information. The two are connected. When the body is more depleted, judgment becomes narrower because the room for experiment shrinks. When the room for experiment shrinks, the group may return more often to weakened patterns simply because they are familiar, even if they are no longer as productive. This is one way a changing climate can trap humans in a cycle of diminishing return. They continue to use knowledge shaped by an older environment because new knowledge is costly to obtain, yet the older knowledge is no longer fully effective. The body pays for this delay through repeated effort. Over time, this repeated effort can alter not only what people do, but what kinds of social pressures they live under. A group that must work harder for less consistent food cannot carry the same margin of safety. Periods of rest may shorten. Decisions about movement may become more urgent. Tolerance for remaining in an uncertain place may weaken, yet the risks of leaving may remain high. Children, older people, and anyone weakened by illness or prior scarcity become especially important in this picture, not because they are passive, but because their needs reveal how narrow the group's margin has become. A food system under strain exposes the biological truth that human life is collective. The body survives through cooperation, and cooperation becomes more difficult when resources lose regularity. This is why the failure of food reliability must be understood as more than an ecological issue. It is a human condition. It reaches into warmth, movement, rest, and social cohesion all at once. It changes how long a group can remain in one place, how confidently it can use memory, and how much strain the body can absorb before errors begin to multiply. In that sense, the colder world associated with this period did not need to erase food from the land to transform human life. It only needed to make nourishment less dependable, less evenly timed, and harder to reach. Once that happened, the body could no longer treat food as part of a familiar rhythm. It had to treat it as an uncertain outcome, one that required more effort each time to secure. And when survival begins to depend on greater effort for smaller certainty, the environment has already changed more deeply than it first appears. When food becomes less reliable and cold begins to demand more from the body, the strain does not remain separate. It gathers into a single condition that shapes how the body functions from moment to moment. The human body is not built with a large margin of insulation against cold. It relies on movement, shelter, and energy intake to maintain warmth. When these supports become unstable, the body must compensate internally, and that compensation has limits. Heat must be generated, but heat generation requires fuel. If fuel is scarce or unevenly available, the body begins to prioritize. It may reduce activity where possible, conserve energy in subtle ways, and narrow the range of what it can sustain. These adjustments are not choices in the conscious sense. They are responses shaped over long periods of evolution, tuned to environments where cold and scarcity followed patterns that could be anticipated. In a world where those patterns weaken, the same responses still occur, but they no longer guarantee the same results. The body may conserve energy, yet still fall short because the next opportunity for nourishment does not arrive as expected. It may move to generate heat, yet expend more energy than it can recover. This creates a state where the body is continually adjusting without fully stabilizing. The effects of this state are often gradual. There is no single point at which the body fails. Instead, there is a slow narrowing of capacity. Muscles may tire more quickly because they are not fully replenished. Exposure to cold may be felt more intensely because reserves are lower. Recovery during rest may become incomplete because the conditions that support full recovery, adequate warmth, and sufficient intake are no longer consistently present. Over time, these small shifts accumulate into a different baseline. The body continues to function, but it does so closer to its limits. This is especially important in environments where movement remains necessary. Humans cannot remain still for long if food must be found across changing landscapes. Movement generates heat and allows access to resources, but it also consumes energy that may not be replaced easily. The body is therefore caught in a balance that is increasingly difficult to maintain. Too little movement leads to greater cold stress and missed opportunities. Too much movement leads to exhaustion and deeper depletion. In more stable conditions, this balance can be learned and adjusted through experience. In a less stable world, the same balance becomes harder to find because the outcomes of action are less predictable. This unpredictability is felt physically. It is present in how far the body can travel before fatigue sets in how long warmth can be maintained during rest, and in how quickly hunger returns after a period of effort. These are not abstract changes. They are the direct interface between the environment and the human organism. Within small groups, the effects of this strain would have been shared, but not evenly. Some individuals may have retained more strength, others less. Yet the group must move at a pace that can be sustained collectively. This introduces another layer of constraint. Decisions about when to move, how far to travel, and where to remain are shaped not only by the environment, but by the condition of the bodies within the group. A colder and less reliable world places pressure on those bodies in ways that reduce the margin for adaptation. The body's ability to recover becomes just as important as its ability to endure. When recovery weakens, endurance itself becomes more costly. This is where the human body reveals both its strength and its vulnerability. It can adjust across a wide range of conditions, but it depends on cycles that allow it to restore itself. If those cycles are disrupted, if warmth is harder to maintain, if food is less regular, if rest is shorter or less complete, the body continues to operate, but with less resilience. And resilience is what allows humans to face repeated challenges without breaking. In this period of renewed cold, the challenge was not a single extreme event. It was the accumulation of many smaller stresses that, together, pushed the body closer to its limits while offering fewer opportunities to recover from them. The body under repeated cold stress does not simply become weaker in a general sense. It becomes more selective. When energy is limited, the organism must constantly allocate what remains between competing needs. Warmth must be maintained. Muscles must still work. The brain must continue guiding movement, attention, and judgment. The immune system, tissue repair, and long-term recovery do not disappear, but they may receive less support when immediate survival takes priority. This is an important part of understanding how a colder, less stable world affects human beings. The damage is not always dramatic or immediate. Often it appears as a narrowing of what the body can still afford to do well. A body that is slightly underfed and frequently cold may still move, still think, still survive, but it does so with less reserve. That loss of reserve matters because reserve is what protects humans from the ordinary shocks of life. A healthy body can absorb a failed search, a difficult night, a minor injury, or an unexpected delay. A body already operating close to its limit cannot absorb these things as easily. What might once have been a manageable difficulty becomes harder to recover from. In this way, cold does not only create discomfort, it changes the meaning of every other strain. This becomes especially serious when the environment remains uncertain for long enough that no full return to recovery is possible. The human body is built around repeated repair. After exertion comes rest. After scarcity comes intake. After exposure comes warmth. But when colder conditions persist and food remains unreliable, each of these repairs becomes incomplete. Rest may happen, but not in deep safety. Food may arrive, but not enough to fully restore strength. Shelter may reduce exposure, but not remove it. The result is a body that continues functioning through partial restoration. Over a short time, that may be survivable. Over longer periods, it changes the baseline from which life is lived. Endurance becomes less about strength and more about careful management of declining margins. This helps explain why environmental stress affects behavior so strongly. When the body feels the cost of every movement more sharply, movement itself must be reconsidered. Distances that were once routine may become expensive. Carrying materials, searching longer, or remaining exposed in wind and cold may demand more than the body can spare. This does not mean people simply stop. It means each action must be measured against a smaller reserve. That reduction in reserve also changes how groups respond to uncertainty. If a landscape becomes harder to read, the natural answer might be wider exploration. But wider exploration requires bodies capable of paying for it. When bodies are already strained, adaptation through movement becomes harder, even though movement remains necessary. This is one of the deepest tensions in the human condition during climatic disruption. The body survives through flexibility, yet flexibility itself depends on energy that instability keeps taking away. There is also a quieter dimension to this pressure. The human body does not live only in the present hour. It carries the effects of yesterday into today. A slightly colder night, a slightly poorer day of intake, a slightly longer period of exposure may each seem survivable on their own, but the body adds them together. What accumulates is not always visible from the outside. It may appear as slower recovery, reduced endurance, less effective decision-making, or greater vulnerability to small setbacks. In a stable environment, such accumulation can often be reversed because the next cycle restores what was lost. In a disrupted one, that restoration may be delayed again and again. This is why the impact of the colder return cannot be measured only by extremes. It must also be understood through repetition. Repeated cold, repeated uncertainty, repeated partial recovery. The body was shaped over deep human time to cope with challenge, but it was not shaped to ignore the arithmetic of energy forever. When warmth costs more, when food returns less regularly, and when recovery is repeatedly interrupted, the body must live more narrowly. It can still endure, it can still adapt, but it does so with a thinner buffer between strain and failure. And in small human groups depending on one another for survival, that thinner buffer would have influenced not only individual bodies, but the pace, risk, and possibilities of life itself. Over time, the combined pressure of cold and uncertain nourishment begins to alter not only what the body can do, but how it experiences effort itself. Tasks that once felt manageable within a known rhythm begin to feel heavier, not because the body has lost its basic capacity, but because the conditions that support that capacity have weakened. Movement across open ground may require more pauses. Carrying materials or following animals may demand more frequent adjustments. Even maintaining warmth during rest can feel less secure, as the body senses that it is working closer to its limits. This shift is subtle, yet it changes the texture of daily life. The body is still capable, but it no longer operates with the same ease or predictability. This is important because human survival has always depended on the ability to repeat effort across many days, not just to perform well in a single moment. Endurance, in this sense, is not only about strength, it is about the ability to sustain cycles of effort and recovery over time. When those cycles weaken, endurance becomes more fragile. A single demanding day can now influence several days that follow, because recovery does not fully restore what has been spent. In a colder and less reliable world, this creates a kind of delayed strain. The body may continue to meet immediate demands, but it carries forward a deficit that shapes what it can do next. This accumulation is rarely dramatic in isolation. It builds quietly through repeated exposure, repeated effort, and incomplete restoration. Over time, it can narrow the range of safe choices available to a group. Distances that could once be traveled regularly may become less certain. Opportunities that once justified risk may no longer be worth the cost. The landscape itself has not necessarily changed in appearance, but its meaning has shifted, because the body interacting with it has changed. The same hill, the same valley, the same water source now require a different calculation of effort and return. This is how environmental stress reshapes perception without altering form. The world looks familiar, but it no longer responds in the same way to human action. Within a group, these changes would have influenced how people coordinated their movements and decisions. When the body's margin becomes thinner, the consequences of misjudgment become greater. A route chosen with insufficient awareness of current conditions may lead to deeper exhaustion. A delay in leaving a place that no longer provides enough resources may carry into several days of increased strain. Because the body can no longer absorb such errors easily, decisions must become more cautious, yet caution itself can reduce opportunities. This creates a balance that is difficult to maintain. Too much caution may prevent access to new resources. Too much risk may lead to losses that cannot be recovered quickly. The human body, shaped to navigate between these extremes, now has less space to do so. This narrowing of possibility is one of the most significant effects of sustained environmental change. It does not remove all options, but it makes each option more costly. In this context, resilience becomes less about enduring a single challenge and more about managing continuous pressure. The body must keep functioning under conditions that rarely allow full recovery, and the group must keep making decisions within that same constraint. Over time, this can change how humans respond to the world at a deeper level. Instead of relying on stable rhythms that guide action, they may begin to rely more on immediate feedback, adjusting more frequently and holding expectations more loosely. This is not a failure of adaptation. It is a different form of adaptation, one shaped by instability rather than continuity. Yet, it comes with a cost. Living in constant adjustment requires more energy, more attention, and more tolerance for uncertainty. And when energy is already limited, that cost is felt directly in the body. This is where the story returns to its central point. The colder conditions associated with this period did not need to overwhelm human beings in a single event. They needed only to shift the balance of effort, recovery, and expectation enough that the body could no longer rely on the rhythms it had been shaped to follow. Once that balance shifted, survival became a more continuous negotiation, carried out within a narrower range of possibility, where the body endured not only the cold itself, but the cumulative weight of a world that had become harder to match. When food grows less reliable and the body operates closer to its limits, movement stops being one option among many and becomes one of the few remaining ways to stay alive. Human beings had always moved. Long before fixed settlements in most regions, mobility was not an exception but part of the structure of life. Yet there is an important difference between movement within a familiar rhythm and movement forced by instability. In a more predictable environment, groups could move according to patterns shaped by memory. Certain places became part of a seasonal sequence. Movement had cost, but it also had meaning. It connected known resources, known shelter, known routes across land that had proved itself before. In a colder and less stable world, that meaning begins to weaken. The body still needs movement because food, water, and usable ground are no longer secure in one place. But movement now carries more uncertainty. A route may still be travelled, yet what waits at the end of it may no longer justify the effort. A place that once served as a dependable stop may now offer little protection or too few resources to matter. This changes the role of movement in human life. It becomes less like returning to what is known and more like searching within a world that no longer confirms recent experience. The body feels this shift directly. To move is to spend energy, but not moving may carry its own danger if the surrounding land is no longer sufficient. This is the central tension. Humans in such conditions are pushed toward action, even as action becomes more expensive. Cold, hunger, and uncertainty narrow the body's reserves. Yet those same pressures demand wider search, longer travel, and greater willingness to leave behind weakened places. This means movement is no longer simply part of survival. It becomes survival itself, even when the body is poorly supplied for it. That does not imply constant wandering in every circumstance. It means that the option to remain still becomes harder to trust. Stillness requires confidence that the land can continue to support the body through the next sequence of days and nights. When that confidence weakens, movement begins earlier, happens more often, or extends farther than before. This would have altered not only how groups crossed landscapes, but how they understood risk. A familiar place might feel safer because it is known, yet staying there too long could deepen scarcity. A new place might hold possibility, but reaching it required energy that might not be replaced soon. Movement, therefore, becomes a decision shaped by incomplete information, where both staying and leaving carry danger. For the human body, this means that migration or relocation is not just a social or geographic event, it is a biological burden. Every step must be paid for in energy. Every delay in finding resources sharpens the cost of the last movement. Every cold exposure during travel reduces the margin available for the next choice. Within small groups, this burden is shared unevenly but managed collectively. Some bodies may tolerate longer movement better than others, yet the group cannot divide its decisions entirely according to the strongest individuals. Children, older adults, the injured, and the already weakened all shape the pace at which movement can occur. This is why forced mobility under climatic stress is so significant. It reveals that human survival is neither purely individual nor purely environmental. It is the meeting point between bodies with limits and landscapes that are becoming harder to trust. In this period, movement likely became less a strategy of confidence and more a response to pressure. People did not move because the world was open and generous. They moved because the places they knew could no longer be relied upon in the same way. The body, evolved to use flexibility as a strength, now had to use that flexibility under worsening terms. And once movement changes from patterned adaptation into necessary uncertainty, the world has already become far less stable for human life than it first appears. As movement becomes more necessary, it also becomes more difficult to organize. In a stable landscape, mobility can be economical. People move with expectation, carrying knowledge that reduces wasted effort. They know which paths are worth the strain, which places can briefly restore the body, and which times of year make travel more manageable. That kind of movement, even when demanding, is still guided by confidence. But once colder conditions disrupt food, water, and the timing of seasons, movement loses some of that efficiency. The same body must now cross a landscape that offers weaker signals and fewer guarantees. This matters because human migration is never just motion across space. It is a sequence of energetic decisions. How far can the body go before reserves fall too low? How much can be carried without turning travel itself into a threat? How long can a group remain exposed before rest becomes necessary? In a colder and less predictable world, these questions become harder to answer, because the places that once justified the effort of reaching them may no longer provide the same return. The result is a more fragile form of mobility. Groups may still move, but they do so with a smaller buffer between action and depletion. A journey that once would have been difficult but manageable may now bring the body closer to exhaustion. A route chosen for familiarity may no longer support recovery along the way. Even short delays can matter more, because the body traveling under colder stress has less room to absorb them. This is where movement begins to reveal its hidden cost. It is easy to imagine migration as adaptation, and in one sense it is. Movement allows humans to respond when local conditions deteriorate, but movement is only adaptive if the body can survive the act of relocating, and if the destination offers enough stability to repay the effort. When both of those conditions become less certain, mobility remains necessary while also becoming more dangerous. This double condition would have shaped human groups in quiet but powerful ways. Decisions about when to leave a place would become more urgent, but also more difficult. Leave too early, and a group may waste energy abandoning a location that still had some value. Leave too late, and they may remain until recovery is no longer possible. The body enters this calculation constantly. Hunger lowers the range of safe travel. Cold shortens the time the body can remain exposed. Poor rest makes the next movement harder than the last. These are not secondary details. They are the actual mechanism through which a large climatic event becomes human experience. The body is where the map turns real. Within a group, movement also changes social rhythm. Travel under pressure compresses decision-making. There is less space for error, less patience for failed routes, and less ability to separate individual need from group survival. The strongest cannot simply move at their own pace, because the group survives together or becomes more vulnerable apart. This means that movement is regulated by the limits of the most exposed bodies, not only the most capable ones. In a harsher world, that can slow migration, shorten the distance a group can safely cover, and increase the importance of every temporary stopping place. A landscape that once seemed wide and usable may begin to feel broken into difficult intervals, each demanding careful judgment about whether the body can continue. Over time, this changes the meaning of human flexibility itself. Flexibility had long been one of the species' great strengths. Humans could change route, shift diet, alter timing, and respond behaviorally to pressure. But flexibility is not infinite. It depends on the body retaining enough reserve to try again when one attempt fails. In a colder world with thinning resources, that reserve shrinks. Each movement must work more quickly. Each decision must carry more weight. And so mobility, which had once allowed humans to live with environmental variation, begins to look different. It becomes less like freedom and more like obligation. The body is no longer moving because movement is simply part of an old rhythm. It is moving because staying still has become increasingly difficult to survive. That is what makes this phase so revealing. It shows that migration is not only a story of distance or direction, it is a story of how much pressure the human body can carry before motion itself becomes one more form of strain. As this pattern continues, movement begins to change in a deeper way. It is no longer guided primarily by the expectation of finding something known at the end of a journey, but by the need to avoid remaining in a place that has become too uncertain to sustain life. This is a subtle but important shift. Moving towards something and moving away from something are not the same. The first carries a sense of direction built from memory. The second carries a sense of pressure, where the body is responding to what can no longer be endured rather than to what can be trusted. In a colder and less predictable world, both forces may be present, but the balance between them begins to change. The body still relies on past knowledge, but that knowledge no longer anchors movement in the same way. Instead, movement becomes more reactive. It is shaped by immediate conditions, by signs that a place is no longer supporting the group, by the accumulation of small failures that signal the need to leave before reserves fall too low. This reactive movement has its own costs. Without strong guidance from reliable patterns, journeys may become less efficient. A group may travel farther than necessary, or return to places that have recently failed simply because alternatives are not yet known. The body pays for these uncertainties through repeated expenditure. Energy is spent not only on reaching a destination, but on discovering whether the destination can still provide what is needed. This creates a cycle in which movement produces information, but obtaining that information requires resources that are already limited. Over time, this changes how risk is distributed across the landscape. In a more stable world, risk can be mapped. Certain areas are known to be less productive, certain times more dangerous, certain routes more reliable. When the environment shifts rapidly, this mapping becomes less precise. Risk spreads more evenly, not because every place is equally dangerous, but because the differences between places become harder to predict in advance. The body then moves through a landscape that offers fewer clear signals about where effort will be rewarded. This lack of clarity increases the importance of short-term feedback. Decisions are adjusted more frequently based on what is immediately observed rather than on what has been consistently true in the past. While this allows for continued adaptation, it also reduces the efficiency of movement. Constant adjustment interrupts the formation of stable routes, and without stable routes, each journey begins to resemble a test rather than a repetition. Within small groups, this condition influences not only how far people travel, but how they relate to the act of moving itself. Movement becomes more cautious in some moments and more urgent in others. A place that still offers minimal support may be held longer than ideal because leaving carries unknown risks. A place that shows early signs of failure may be abandoned quickly because waiting could deepen scarcity. These decisions are shaped by the condition of the body. When reserves are low, tolerance for uncertainty shrinks. The group cannot afford to wait for clarity. It must act before full information is available. This means that movement is often initiated under incomplete understanding, and that incomplete understanding becomes part of the cost of survival. Over time, This can lead to a form of continuous relocation, not necessarily across vast distances at once, but through repeated shorter movements that reflect the instability of the environment. Each movement seeks to restore balance, yet each movement also carries the risk of further imbalance if the destination fails to provide. The body endures this cycle by constantly recalibrating effort, adjusting to new conditions, and absorbing the consequences of decisions that cannot be made with certainty. This is how a large climatic shift enters human life at the level of daily action. It transforms movement from a patterned response into a sequence of necessary adjustments, each one shaped by a world that no longer offers the same guidance it once did. And in that transformation, the human body reveals both its capacity to endure and the limits within which that endurance must operate. A changing climate does not have to erase a landscape to make it unfamiliar. The hills may remain where they were, rivers may still cut through the same valleys, open ground may still look passable, and old roots may still exist beneath the feet. Yet the usefulness of these places can shift long before their shape does. This is one of the most difficult conditions for human beings to live through, because the body is strongly guided by recognition. A familiar place lowers uncertainty. It suggests where shelter might be found, where water might still collect, where food once appeared, and where movement could be made with less risk. But when colder conditions begin to alter the timing and productivity of a region, that familiarity becomes less dependable. A place that still looks known may no longer behave as it once did. The body, which expects continuity between appearance and function, begins to encounter a quieter form of danger. What seems usable may no longer support life in the same way. This matters because human survival depends not simply on being in the right place, but on arriving there at the right time, under the right conditions, with enough remaining energy to benefit from what the place provides. If a valley still offers shelter but less food, or if a river still exists but its seasonal behavior has changed, then memory begins to mislead without intending to. The landscape remains legible in form but unstable in meaning. For human groups, this would have created a deep tension between trust and doubt. Returning to a known place would still feel reasonable because it had worked before, yet repeated disappointments would begin to weaken that trust. The body experiences this not through abstract awareness, but through failed recovery. A place reached with effort no longer restores what the effort cost. Shelter may still be there, but warmth remains difficult. Water may still be near, but food is sparse or delayed. The route itself may still be passable, but the reward at the end of it has thinned. In such conditions, the body begins to learn a harder lesson. Recognition is no longer enough. What once could be assumed must now be tested again. This turns every familiar landscape into a provisional one. It may still sustain the group, but it must prove itself repeatedly. That repeated testing increases strain because the body cannot rely on memory as a full guide. It must combine memory with caution, and caution takes time, energy, and constant attention. In colder conditions, those costs are heavier because the body is already paying more simply to remain warm. This is why environmental disruption affects not only resources, but also perception. It changes how humans read space. Known ground becomes less stable in psychological and physical terms. A route that once felt secure now carries uncertainty beneath its familiarity. A resting place that once promised recovery now offers only partial relief. Over time, this weakens the practical bond between body and place. People still move through remembered landscapes, but they do so with less confidence that those landscapes will respond in familiar ways. That reduced confidence can alter behavior significantly. Groups may leave places sooner, return to them more cautiously, or divide their effort across a wider range of locations to reduce dependence on any single site. Yet spreading effort also means spreading energy more thinly. Once again, the body is pulled into a difficult balance. Trust too much, and it risks remaining in a place that no longer sustains life. Trust too little, and it spends too much moving between uncertain alternatives. This is what makes a rapidly changing world so demanding. It does not force humans into completely alien terrain. It leaves them in places that still resemble the world they knew, while quietly changing the terms on which that world can support them. The body, shaped over long human history to survive through patterned recognition, now has to live in landscapes where recognition still works just enough to tempt trust, but no longer enough to guarantee survival. As this mismatch deepens, The human relationship with place begins to shift from familiarity toward continuous evaluation. A landscape that once offered a sequence of reliable outcomes becomes something that must be questioned each time it is encountered. This does not erase memory, but it changes how memory is used. Instead of guiding action with confidence, memory becomes one piece of information among others, and it must be tested against present conditions. The body feels this shift through repetition. A location reached after effort may still offer something, but not enough to restore what has been spent. Another place may appear less promising, yet provide slightly more in that moment. These small differences accumulate, and over time they reshape how people interpret space. The land is no longer organized into clear zones of expectation. It becomes uneven in a way that is harder to predict in advance. For the human body, this means that movement through space is no longer simply about distance or direction. It becomes about managing uncertainty across each step. Each movement must account for the possibility that what lies ahead may not align with what is remembered. This requires more frequent adjustment. Routes may be altered partway through. Stops may be shorter or longer depending on what is found. Decisions may be revised repeatedly as new information appears. While this allows continued adaptation, it also increases the cost of every journey. More time is spent confirming whether a place is still usable. More energy is spent correcting paths that no longer lead to expected outcomes. This is where the instability of the environment begins to shape the rhythm of life in a more direct way. Instead of moving within a known sequence, groups move within a shifting set of possibilities. This reduces efficiency, because efficiency depends on repetition. The body can perform a repeated action with less cost than a constantly changing one. When each journey differs from the last, the body must remain more alert, more responsive, and more prepared to adjust. That constant readiness draws on energy, even when no immediate danger is present. In colder conditions, where energy is already under pressure, this added demand becomes significant. It means that even successful movement carries a hidden cost, because the body cannot relax into a predictable pattern of action and recovery. Within small groups, this shift affects coordination. When the landscape no longer offers clear signals, agreement becomes harder to maintain. Decisions about where to go or how long to stay rely on interpretations that may differ between individuals. Some may favor returning to familiar places, trusting that conditions might improve. Others may push toward new areas, seeking alternatives despite the risk. These differences are not conflicts in a simple sense. They reflect the difficulty of acting under incomplete information. The group must choose a direction without certainty, and once that choice is made, it shapes the condition of every body within it. If the decision proves less effective than hoped, the cost is shared. The body absorbs this through longer effort, deeper fatigue, and reduced opportunity to recover. Over time, this can influence how much variation a group is willing to tolerate. Too much variation increases risk. Too little variation may prevent the discovery of new stable patterns. The environment, meanwhile, continues to shift in ways that do not align neatly with either approach. This creates a persistent tension between exploration and caution, both of which are necessary, yet both of which carry cost. In this way, a changing landscape does not simply remove resources, it alters the process by which humans locate and use them. The body, which depends on patterns to reduce effort, is now forced into a mode where patterns are weaker and must be rebuilt under pressure. Each step through the land becomes part of that rebuilding, yet each step also consumes the energy needed to continue. This is how the instability of place becomes a direct pressure on the human organism. It is not only about where people go, it is about how much uncertainty the body must carry while it goes there. What emerges from this condition is not simply a harder landscape, but a different kind of human presence within it. People are no longer moving through space as if it were a known partner in survival. They are moving through it as if it must be negotiated again and again. A place may still offer shelter, but only for a shorter time. A route may still connect important points, but with less certainty that those points will remain useful when reached. The land begins to lose its former continuity, not because it disappears, but because the body can no longer depend on its repeated behavior in the same way. This matters deeply for human beings, because much of survival depends on reducing uncertainty before it becomes dangerous. The body works best when it can prepare. It can conserve energy in advance of scarcity, move in advance of worsening cold, and rest when the environment offers a brief window of safety. When places no longer behave consistently, those preparations become less exact. The body still prepares, but with less confidence that the preparation fits the conditions ahead. That mismatch creates a quiet burden. More energy is spent anticipating what may not happen. More caution is carried into places that once required less. More effort must be held in reserve because the body cannot trust that recovery will come where it once did. Over time, this changes what familiarity means. Familiarity no longer guarantees support. It only lowers the cost of recognizing where one is. But recognition alone is not enough if the land no longer responds in expected ways. The body then has to live in an unusual tension, surrounded by shapes, roots, and places that seem known, while constantly discovering that their old meanings are thinning. This can produce a form of instability more exhausting than obvious danger. Obvious danger can trigger direct response. Hidden instability forces prolonged uncertainty, and prolonged uncertainty asks the body to remain attentive without the relief of resolution. In colder conditions, that attentiveness is expensive. It lengthens the time before a group can fully settle, shortens the confidence with which a place can be used, and encourages shorter-term decisions because long-term trust has weakened. The result is a different rhythm of occupation. Groups may remain in places more provisionally, investing less confidence in any single site. They may rotate between locations more often, not because such movement is ideal, but because no place fully justifies deep trust. This would have altered the social meaning of landscapes as well. A place once known across repeated visits as dependable might now be spoken of more cautiously through shared memory. The group's knowledge of space becomes more conditional. Instead of saying, in effect, "this place provides," experience begins to suggest this place sometimes provides, under certain conditions, for a limited time. That change may sound small, but for a species that survives by turning repeated experience into practical guidance, it is profound. It weakens the bond between memory and confidence. And once confidence weakens, every decision about movement, rest, and effort becomes harder to make cleanly. The body carries this difficulty in subtle ways. It may delay full rest because the site feels less secure. It may push onward sooner because signs of decline are noticed earlier. It may spend more energy scanning, testing, and recalculating rather than moving within a stable routine. These responses help preserve survival, but they also keep the body in a more strained state. This is the deeper legacy of a landscape that no longer matches memory. The world does not have to become visually strange to become biologically difficult. It only has to stop rewarding familiar knowledge with familiar outcomes. Once that happens, the human body must continue through a terrain that still looks partly known, but no longer offers the same dependable relationship between effort and return. And in that quiet break between appearance and function, the land becomes something more than cold or empty. It becomes uncertain in its very usefulness, which may be one of the hardest conditions a human body can be asked to endure. In a world like this, small human groups would have carried both their greatest strength and their greatest fragility at the same time. The strength lay in cooperation. Humans survive difficult environments not because each individual body is exceptionally protected, but because bodies work together. Knowledge is shared, effort is distributed. Children are carried through conditions they could not survive alone, and the old or weakened remain part of the group because human survival has long depended on social bonds rather than physical independence. But that same structure also creates vulnerability when the environment becomes unstable. A small group has limited reserves. It cannot divide risk endlessly. It cannot lose many members without changing what it is capable of doing. When food becomes irregular, movement more costly, and familiar places less dependable, the pressure does not fall on one person at a time. It spreads through the entire group, because each body depends on the others for warmth, protection, knowledge, and coordinated action. This is why environmental disruption becomes especially serious at the scale of the group. A single healthy individual might endure several days of strain, but a group must think in terms of everyone's limits at once. The pace of travel is shaped not by the strongest alone, but by the most vulnerable. Decisions about when to leave, how far to go, and where to rest are constrained by bodies that recover at different speeds and carry different burdens. In a stable world, such variation can be managed more easily because the environment offers more predictable opportunities to recover. In a colder and less reliable world, that variation becomes harder to absorb. A delay caused by exhaustion, injury, or reduced strength may not be a temporary inconvenience. It may affect how much food the whole group can secure, how long exposure to cold continues, or whether the next movement can happen before conditions worsen again. This means that fragility is not a sign of weakness in the moral sense. It is simply the condition of being a small, interdependent group in an environment where the margin for recovery has narrowed. The human body is social, and that sociality is what allowed humans to survive across many climates and landscapes. Yet social survival also means that instability reaches further. A group can share effort, but it must also share scarcity. It can divide tasks, but it cannot divide away uncertainty. The failure of one search, the loss of one route, or the weakness of one sheltering place affects more than one body. It alters the condition of the collective. This is especially important when thinking about a colder phase that unfolds over years rather than as one single disaster. Long-term instability tests not only strength, but endurance in cooperation. It asks whether the group can continue coordinating under conditions where old knowledge is less dependable and new knowledge is costly to build. The answer would have varied from place to place, but the pressure itself would have been real. Small groups are resilient partly because they are flexible, but flexibility has scale limits. A group cannot fragment into too many smaller parts without losing safety. It cannot gather into very large numbers without increasing pressure on local resources. It must remain within a narrow social balance while the environment itself is becoming less balanced. The body feels this through more than hunger or cold. It feels it through the constant need to synchronize with others under worsening terms. To wait when one body wants to move when another needs rest, to stay together when conditions favor speed for some and caution for others. These are not abstract social questions. They are biological realities, because human beings survive through coordination, and coordination becomes more expensive when the world becomes less forgiving. In that sense, the real fragility of small groups lies not only in their numbers, but in how much each body matters to the functioning of all the others. When environmental pressure rises, the group does not simply become smaller or weaker, it becomes more sensitive, and, quote, more exposed to the consequences of delay, error, depletion, and loss. And in a world that had turned colder and less legible, that sensitivity may have been one of the deepest signs that human life was being asked to endure beyond the comfort of its usual margins. When conditions remain uncertain for long enough, the burden on a small group begins to change from simple cooperation into constant balancing. Every group depends on shared effort, but shared effort works best when the environment offers enough predictability for roles, timing, and movement to settle into rhythm. In a colder and less stable world, that rhythm weakens. Tasks still need to be divided. Some bodies may search, others may stay with children, maintain shelter, watch over stored materials, or preserve what little stability can still be created. But the success of any one task depends more heavily on the uncertain success of the others. If those who move return with less food than expected, the value of staying in place changes. If exposure during travel is worse than expected, the next movement may need to be delayed. If the place chosen for temporary rest proves weaker than hoped, then every earlier decision must be reconsidered at once. This is where the fragility of small groups becomes more visible. Their strength lies in interdependence, yet interdependence also means that strain is easily transmitted. One body falling into deeper exhaustion does not remain an individual problem. It changes carrying capacity, travel speed, and the amount of labor available for the next day. One failed route is not only a loss of time, it reduces trust in the knowledge used to guide the group, and that reduced trust spreads into later decisions. In a stable world, these effects can often be absorbed because the group expects some failures and knows that the landscape will still offer correction. In an unstable world, correction may not come quickly. The group must absorb more pressure with fewer guarantees. This affects how decisions are made. More caution may protect bodies from immediate loss, but too much caution can trap the group in a weakening place. More boldness may open access to better conditions, but it may also cost energy the group cannot afford to lose. Small groups cannot solve this tension completely because the problem is built into their size. They are large enough to require coordination, but small enough that every change in the condition of one body matters. A larger population might distribute losses more widely. A solitary person might move faster, but lose the benefits of cooperation. A small human group sits between those extremes, and that middle position is both its advantage and its vulnerability. The body feels this through social rhythm as much as through cold or hunger. A group under pressure must wait more carefully, move more carefully, and choose more carefully. But careful living is not without cost. It slows action, limits experimentation, and may reduce the range of solutions available. This is especially serious in an environment where old patterns no longer guide survival with the same confidence. The group needs new learning, yet new learning often requires risk. It requires entering places not recently used, changing timing, altering routes, and testing whether unfamiliar conditions can support life. For a small group already operating with thin reserves, such testing may be necessary but difficult to sustain. This is how fragility deepens, not through sudden collapse alone, but through the shrinking ability to explore without consequence. Over time, the collective body of the group becomes more conservative because the cost of error has risen. Yet the landscape itself may now demand experimentation, because familiar places are losing value. This mismatch between what the group can safely attempt and what the environment now requires may have been one of the quietest but most powerful pressures on human life during this colder phase. The group survives by staying together, yet staying together means carrying each other's limits into every decision. That is the beauty and the burden of human survival. Cooperation expands what a single body can endure, but under unstable conditions it also binds every body more tightly to the rising cost of the world around them. Over time, the fragility of small groups becomes visible not only in what they lack, but in how little room remains for ordinary disruption. In a more stable environment, a group can often survive small misfortunes because the landscape still offers ways to recover. A difficult stretch of days may be followed by better conditions. A failed search may be corrected by the next successful one. A person weakened for a short time may recover, while others compensate. These possibilities do not remove hardship, but they widen the margin within which human cooperation can work. In a colder and less predictable world, that margin narrows. Recovery still happens, but less fully. Compensation is still possible, but more costly. The group can still absorb strain, yet each act of absorption leaves fewer reserves for what comes next. This is where small groups become truly fragile. Not because they stop functioning, but because functioning itself begins to consume too much of what they need in order to remain resilient. The human body is social by necessity, and in such conditions the group behaves almost like a single extended organism. Energy, attention, movement, and risk are distributed across many bodies, but the success of each depends on the condition of the others. If one person becomes slower, someone else must adjust. If one route fails, everyone pays through lost time and lost energy. If cold deepens and rest becomes incomplete, the next day begins not from renewal but from partial depletion. This means the group is not only facing the environment, it is also constantly managing the consequences of how the environment has already entered its own bodies. In such a state, small differences matter more. A little less food, a little more exposure, a little more uncertainty in timing. These do not seem dramatic on their own, but within a small group they can reshape the entire balance of cooperation. Tasks become harder to distribute cleanly because every body is carrying more strain. The group may still hunt, gather, move, shelter, and care for the vulnerable, but each of these tasks draws from a pool of energy that is being refilled less reliably. This creates a quiet compression of possibility. Fewer choices feel safe. Fewer delays feel survivable. Fewer mistakes can be treated as temporary. The group becomes more cautious because caution protects what remains, yet too much caution can also trap people within a weakening pattern. That is the deeper vulnerability of small human groups under long environmental stress. They cannot stop cooperating because cooperation is their strength, but cooperation itself becomes heavier when every shared decision carries a higher cost. This pressure would not necessarily appear as dramatic breakdown in every case. It may instead appear as shorter stays, narrower movement, less tolerance for experimentation, and greater sensitivity to any sign that conditions are worsening again. In this sense, fragility is not the opposite of resilience. It is what resilience begins to look like when practiced close to the edge. The group is still adapting, still enduring, still making decisions together, but it is doing so with thinner protection against error and with less confidence that the environment will forgive delay. This is why small groups matter so much in this story. They show that human survival is never only about climate in the abstract, nor only about the isolated body. It is about the scale at which bodies must live together. A single human cannot survive such instability alone for long. A larger society with stored abundance might distribute stress differently, but a small prehistoric group lives within a very narrow band where each body matters, each decision matters, and each failed expectation enters directly into the life of all the others. In a colder world that no longer matched recent memory, this sensitivity may have been one of the most important truths of human existence. The group did not simply face scarcity or cold. It faced the possibility that the smallest disruptions could now travel farther through the collective than before, turning ordinary difficulty into something heavier, more persistent, and harder to recover from. And when that happens, survival is no longer measured only by strength or knowledge, but by how long a small circle of human bodies can continue carrying one another through a world that has become less willing to carry them. Much of what we can say about this period comes not from voices but from residue. The people who lived through changing cold left no direct account of what they felt, and so the ground becomes the closest thing we have to memory. Yet the ground does not speak clearly. It preserves fragments, a scatter of stone tools, traces of hearths, shifts in where people stayed, signs that certain places were used differently over time. None of these remains gives us a complete story on its own. They must be read cautiously, because archaeology does not show emotion, motive, or certainty. What it can show is pattern. And patterns matter, because this entire story has been about what happens when the patterns linking body, environment, and survival begin to change. In that sense, the material traces left behind are valuable not because they solve the mystery completely, but because they reveal where human behavior may have adjusted under pressure. A site used repeatedly across time may begin to show changes in occupation, in the distribution of tools, or in the kinds of activities carried out there. This does not tell us exactly what a group thought, but it can suggest that the relationship between people and place was shifting. A location once suitable for longer use may later appear more temporary. A region may show signs of repeated return, but with altered intensity or different forms of use. These are small differences. Yet small differences matter when we are trying to understand how a changing world entered everyday human life. The body does not fossilize its uncertainty directly. What it leaves behind are the arrangements created by action under uncertainty. A hearth placed in one position rather than another, a camp used more briefly, tools carried differently across space. These are not dramatic signs of catastrophe. They are quieter indications that human behavior may have become more provisional, more mobile, or more tightly shaped by changing conditions. The same caution applies to stone tools themselves. Changes in tool forms or in how stone was transported across the landscape do not automatically prove a single climatic cause. Human societies are always dynamic, and many forces can influence behavior. But when archaeological evidence is placed beside broader environmental evidence, a picture sometimes begins to emerge. Not a perfect picture, and not one with equal clarity in every region, but one suggesting that human groups were adjusting their use of space, their movement, and perhaps their subsistence strategies in response to shifting conditions. This is why archaeology matters so much here. It gives us a way to return from abstract climate to embodied life. A colder period is easy to imagine at a distance, but harder to understand as a lived condition. Material traces help narrow that distance. They show that human life was organized in places, through repeated acts, under constraints that sometimes changed. And when those acts begin to look less stable, less rooted, or differently distributed, we may be seeing not simply cultural variation, but the imprint of bodies adapting to a world that had become harder to trust. Even absence can matter, though it must be treated carefully. A place used less often may suggest movement elsewhere, but it may also reflect preservation, discovery, or many other limits in the record. Archaeology teaches restraint as much as knowledge. It reminds us that the human past survives unevenly, and that what is missing cannot automatically be turned into proof. Yet even with that restraint, the ground still offers something essential. It shows that humans did not pass through this world without leaving marks of adjustment. The traces are incomplete, but they are enough to suggest that changing environments were met, not by stillness, but by altered patterns of use, movement, and occupation. And this matters because it returns the story once more to the human body. People left behind not a theory of climate, but evidence that life had to be arranged differently. In stone, ash, and repeated disturbance of the earth, we find signs that survival was being renegotiated in material form. Archaeological traces become especially meaningful when they suggest not just presence, but changes in pattern. A single camp or tool tells us very little on its own, but when similar places are compared across time, or when repeated use of a landscape begins to look different from what came before, the ground starts to reveal something about how human bodies were being forced to adapt. This is where caution and insight must remain together. We cannot say that every change in a site reflects colder climate directly. Human groups are never shaped by one factor alone. Yet, if broader environmental evidence points to renewed cooling and instability, and if the archaeological record in some regions begins to show shifts in settlement use, mobility, or the organization of material life, then those traces deserve close attention. They may not tell us exactly why people changed, but they can show that change happened in ways consistent with a world becoming less predictable. One of the clearest signs to look for is whether occupation appears more temporary, more interrupted, or more variable than before. A place that had once supported repeated and possibly longer stays may later show evidence of shorter use, lighter material buildup, or more fragmented activity. This does not prove crisis in a dramatic sense, but it does suggest that the relationship between people and place may have become less stable. The body enters this picture through the very logic of occupation. To remain in one place long enough to leave dense traces, a group must find enough support there to justify stillness. If support weakens, occupation may become briefer, more conditional, or more frequently abandoned. The result is not only a different archaeological signature, but a different rhythm of life. Another clue can appear in how materials move across space. If stone suitable for tools is carried farther, reused more carefully, or appears in different patterns than before, that may reflect changes in mobility or in how groups managed risk. A body living in a more uncertain world cannot afford to treat useful materials casually. Tools are not separate from biology. They extend the body's ability to cut, process, hunt, and adapt. When the environment grows less dependable, tools may become even more important because they help compensate for what the body itself cannot do efficiently on its own. This means that subtle changes in tool use can point back toward the same deeper problem. The body is trying to preserve function inside a world that has become more demanding. Hearths also matter. Fire is one of the oldest human ways of altering environmental pressure. It creates warmth, extends usable time, and supports social and bodily recovery. Changes in the placement, frequency, or character of hearths may therefore carry significance, though again not in a simple or universal way. A hearth is never just a fire mark in the ground. It is evidence that a group gathered, paused, warmed itself, and tried to create a pocket of stability within unstable conditions. If the use of hearths changes, it may reflect shifts in mobility, in exposure to cold, or in how long a site could support life before movement became necessary again. Even the distribution of debris across a site can hint at altered behavior. More tightly organized activity areas, lighter occupation, or different patterns of discard may suggest that life in such places had become more provisional. None of these traces allow us to say exactly what any one group experienced, but taken together, they help us see a broader truth. Humans did not encounter climatic instability only in the air or in the distant environment. They encountered it in where they stopped, how long they stayed, what they carried, what they repaired, and what they left behind. The archaeological record is therefore not only a record of objects, it is a record of bodily decisions made under changing pressure. Stone, ash, and scattered remains do not tell us everything, but they do show that survival was being restructured in practical terms. And when those practical terms begin to shift across landscapes that were themselves changing, the ground preserves something very close to the outline of human adaptation. Not a dramatic speech, but a rearrangement of life itself. What the archaeological record offers at its most honest is not certainty, but restraint shaped into evidence. It reminds us that human adaptation is often visible only indirectly, through changes in the arrangement of life rather than through unmistakable signs of crisis. This matters because the story of a colder world is easy to exaggerate if we demand dramatic traces at every step. In reality, much of the pressure on human groups would have appeared through quieter shifts. Places may have been used more briefly, materials may have been carried differently, repeated occupations may have become thinner, more broken, or more uneven across time. None of this tells us that every group experienced the same hardship in the same way. It tells us something more careful and perhaps more valuable. The terms under which people used the land were not entirely stable. That instability is where archaeology becomes deeply human. The body does not leave behind its fatigue directly, but fatigue can shape how long a group remains in one place. The body does not fossilize its uncertainty, but uncertainty can influence how much material is transported, how often a site is reused, and how provisional occupation becomes. In this way, the ground preserves not inner feeling but outer consequence. It shows that decisions about rest, movement, warmth, and resource use were being made within conditions that may have been shifting enough to alter habitual patterns. This is especially important when we place archaeology beside environmental evidence for renewed cooling and instability. The goal is not to force every trace into a single explanation, but to see whether different kinds of evidence begin to lean in the same direction. When they do, a quieter interpretation becomes possible. Human groups may have been living in ways that were increasingly conditional. Places once folded into familiar cycles of return may have become harder to trust. Occupation may have become lighter not because humans lost the will to remain, but because the body and the group could no longer rely on those places in the same way. This is the value of the archaeological record. It keeps bringing us back from broad climate language to practical human life. A colder world becomes visible not only through ice or pollen, but through how people arrange themselves around fire, stone, shelter, and movement. Even the absence of dense remains can matter if treated with caution, because it can suggest that the conditions needed for repeated, confident occupation were no longer fully present. Yet archaeology also protects us from going too far. It does not allow us to claim that every gap means collapse or that every change proves disaster. The record is incomplete, uneven, and shaped by preservation as much as by human action. That incompleteness is not a weakness of the story, it is part of its honesty. We are not hearing a direct testimony from the people who lived through these changes. We are seeing the outline of their responses through what was left behind after many things disappeared. And that outline is enough to tell us something important. Human beings did not pass through this colder phase unchanged. Whether through shorter stays, altered use of tools, shifting movement across land, or new ways of organizing temporary stability, the material record suggests that life was being adjusted under pressure. The body remained the center of that adjustment, even when the evidence survives only in stone and soil. People still needed warmth, still needed food, still needed enough certainty to know where to rest and when to move. If the traces of those actions begin to look more provisional, more fragmented, or more carefully arranged, then we may be seeing the ground's quiet answer to the question of what it means when the world changes faster than recent memory can absorb. Not a dramatic proclamation, but a series of altered habits, each one small, each one material, each one suggesting that human survival had to be reorganized within a landscape that no longer offered the same dependable terms as before. Human beings are often described as highly adaptable, and in many ways that is true. Few large mammals have lived across such a wide range of climates and landscapes, while relying on bodies that are, by themselves, relatively exposed. Humans do not possess thick fur for severe cold, extraordinary speed for escape, or the kind of narrow specialization that fits one stable habitat perfectly. Their strength lies elsewhere, in behavior, cooperation, memory, and the ability to alter tools, shelter, and movement in response to changing conditions. Yet adaptability is not the same as limitlessness. To say that humans can adapt is not to say that they can do so without cost, without delay, or without entering periods of deep vulnerability when change moves too quickly. This distinction matters here because the colder phase associated with this period did not confront human beings with an unfamiliar truth that adaptation is possible. Humans had already survived cold before. What it revealed more clearly was that adaptation has speed limits, energy limits, and social limits. The body can adjust behavior much faster than it can adjust biology. It can move sooner than it can evolve. It can change route, diet, timing, and sheltering patterns. But all of these responses depend on reserve. They depend on the body having enough energy left to experiment, enough social coordination left to act collectively, and enough environmental feedback left to learn which new behaviors are worth repeating. When those conditions weaken at the same time, adaptation becomes narrower. The body may still respond, but with fewer safe options available. This is why a rapidly changing environment places such pressure on human life. It does not simply demand a response. It demands a response before the old one has been fully replaced, and before the body has had time to build a new rhythm it can trust. In practical terms, this means there is always a dangerous interval between disruption and successful adjustment. During that interval, the body must continue living even though its inherited expectations and recent experience are no longer fully reliable. That is the space where human limits become visible. Not because humans stop adapting, but because adaptation itself becomes more costly than usual. A route can be changed, but the wrong new route may waste precious energy. Food sources can be shifted, but discovering which alternatives still work takes time and movement. A group can relocate, but relocation may expose the body to more cold and deeper fatigue before any reward is found. These are limits not of intelligence, but of embodied survival. The human organism must pay for every experiment in calories, time, and risk. When the world is stable, those payments are manageable because new knowledge quickly produces return. When the world is unstable, payment comes first, and return is uncertain. This is one of the quiet truths about human adaptation. It works best when the environment changes slowly enough to let learning accumulate into habit. It works less smoothly when conditions change fast enough to break habit before new guidance has formed. The body then lives between systems, no longer fully supported by the old one and not yet secured by the new. That in-between state may be one of the most demanding conditions humans ever face. It is not the same as catastrophe in a single instant. It is often more drawn out, more subtle, and more exhausting. The body continues to survive, but survival becomes a sequence of shorter calculations, each one made with less margin and less certainty. This is why it is important not to romanticize flexibility. Human flexibility is real, but it is never free. It depends on cooperation, repeated learning, and physical reserves that can be depleted. When cold returns, when food becomes unreliable, when places stop behaving as memory expects, the body reaches the edge of what flexibility alone can easily solve. Beyond that edge, adaptation still happens, but it happens under strain, and strain leaves marks on movement, occupation, social life, and the practical use of space. In that sense, the deeper lesson of this period is not that humans failed to adapt. It is that adaptation itself has a threshold, and when environmental change approaches that threshold too quickly, even a remarkably flexible species begins to reveal how narrow the band of survivable adjustment can be. When the limits of adaptation are approached, the body does not stop responding, but it begins to choose more carefully what it can continue to support. This is where adaptation becomes selective rather than expansive. In a stable or slowly changing environment, humans can explore a range of strategies at once. They can test different routes, vary their use of resources, and adjust timing with enough margin to learn from failure. But when conditions tighten, that margin shrinks. The body cannot afford to explore widely without consequence. It must narrow its choices, focusing effort on what seems most likely to work, even if that likelihood is no longer as strong as it once was. This narrowing is not a sign of weakness. It is a form of protection. By reducing the range of possible actions, the body tries to conserve what remains of its energy and reduce exposure to further risk. Yet this protection carries its own cost. A narrower range of action means fewer chances to discover new stable patterns. It means that the body may continue to rely on weakened strategies longer than it would in a less pressured situation, simply because those strategies are familiar and less costly to attempt. Over time, this can slow the process by which new forms of adaptation take hold. The body is still learning, but it is learning under constraint. This helps explain why environmental instability can produce a prolonged period of difficulty rather than a rapid shift into a new stable way of life. The path forward is not immediately clear, and the cost of searching for it is high. For human groups, this selective adaptation would have shaped both movement and decision-making. Some routes may have been abandoned not because they were completely unusable, but because they became too uncertain to justify the effort. Some resources may have been used more intensively, not because they were abundant, but because they were among the few options that remained somewhat predictable. The body adjusts its expectations accordingly. It begins to treat partial reliability as sufficient, because complete reliability is no longer available. This is another quiet change in the human condition. The standard for what counts as a successful outcome shifts downward, not by choice, but by necessity. Survival becomes less about optimizing conditions and more about maintaining continuity within reduced possibilities. The body can still endure, but it must do so by accepting lower returns, shorter recovery, and less certainty in what lies ahead. This shift is also visible in how risk is approached. In a more stable world, risk can be taken with the expectation that failure will be followed by recovery. In a less stable one, risk becomes heavier because failure may not be easily corrected. The body therefore becomes more cautious, but not in a simple way. It must still act, still move, still seek food and shelter. Caution does not remove action, it reshapes it. It favors actions that are more certain, even if they offer smaller rewards, and it avoids actions that might bring larger benefits but also carry the chance of deeper loss. This is how adaptation under pressure can lead to more conservative patterns of behavior, not because humans lose their ability to innovate, but because the environment reduces the safety of innovation. Every new attempt must be weighed against the body's limited reserves, and when those reserves are low, even promising alternatives may be delayed or avoided. This creates a tension that is difficult to resolve. The body needs new solutions, yet it cannot fully afford to search for them. The result is a period in which adaptation continues, but at a slower and more constrained pace. Changes accumulate gradually, often unevenly, as different groups find different ways to navigate the same pressures. Some may shift more quickly, others more slowly, depending on local conditions and the resources available to them. This variation is part of the human story, but it unfolds within a shared boundary. All groups are working within the limits set by their bodies and by the environment that is changing around them. In this way, the colder phase does not eliminate human adaptability, it reframes it. It shows that adaptability is not a simple ability to change, but a process that depends on energy, time, and the reliability of feedback from the world. When those supports weaken, adaptation becomes narrower, slower, and more costly, and the human body, which must carry that process forward, reveals through its limits how much of survival depends not only on what is possible, but on what can be afforded. At this point, adaptation no longer appears as a broad ability to reshape life freely, but as a careful negotiation with limits that cannot be ignored. The body continues to respond, but it does so within a narrowing frame where each adjustment must be weighed against what it costs to attempt it. This is where the idea of human flexibility reaches its most revealing form. Flexibility is not the absence of constraint. It is the ability to continue operating inside constraint without breaking entirely. And in a colder, less predictable world, that ability is tested not once, but repeatedly, across many small decisions that shape daily life. The body does not experience this as a single challenge. It experiences it as a sequence of trade-offs. More movement may lead to better chances of finding food, but it also increases exposure and fatigue. Remaining in place may conserve energy, but it risks deeper scarcity if conditions do not improve. Using familiar strategies may reduce immediate uncertainty, but it may also limit the discovery of better options. Trying new strategies may open possibility, but it may also fail at a cost the body cannot easily absorb. These are not abstract dilemmas. They are embodied calculations that occur through action, feedback, and adjustment. Over time, such trade-offs shape the range of what becomes possible, not in the sense of what humans could imagine, but in what they could sustain. A strategy that works once but cannot be repeated is not a stable solution. A place that provides briefly but fails soon after cannot support long-term presence. The body, which must live through sequences rather than moments, gradually filters out what cannot be sustained, even if it appears promising at first. This filtering process is part of adaptation, but under pressure it becomes stricter. The body becomes less able to afford unsuccessful trials. It must rely more heavily on what works often enough to maintain continuity, even if those options are less productive than before. This is how adaptation under strain leads to a quieter form of survival. Life continues, but within tighter bounds. The environment does not have to eliminate all resources to produce this effect. It only has to make those resources less dependable, less evenly distributed, and harder to integrate into a stable pattern. Once that happens, the body can no longer build the same kind of rhythm it once relied on. It must live within a series of shorter cycles, each one shaped by immediate conditions rather than by long-term expectation. This shortening of horizon is one of the deeper signs that adaptation has reached a limit. The body still looks ahead, but it cannot project as far with confidence. Plans become nearer, more provisional, more dependent on what is observed in the moment. This does not mean that humans lose foresight. It means that foresight must operate under greater uncertainty, and therefore carries less assurance. In such a state, resilience is no longer measured only by the ability to endure a single hardship. It is measured by how long the body can continue making these trade-offs without collapsing under their cumulative weight. The group must continue coordinating, the body must continue moving, warmth must still be maintained, and food must still be found. Yet, each of these requirements is now being met under conditions that reduce efficiency and increase cost. Over time, this accumulation becomes the defining feature of life. Not one overwhelming disaster, but a persistent narrowing of what can be sustained comfortably. And within that narrowing, human beings continue to adapt, not because the world allows easy solutions, but because the body is capable of enduring complexity for longer than might be expected. Still, that endurance has boundaries. It depends on the environment offering enough stability, even in altered form, for new patterns to take hold. If that stability remains out of reach for too long, adaptation slows, strain deepens, and survival itself becomes more uncertain. This is where the colder phase reveals something essential about the human condition. It shows that adaptation is always a negotiation between possibility and cost, and that when the cost rises faster than new possibilities can be secured, even a highly flexible species must live closer to the edge of what it can sustain. For most of human history, learning did not happen in books or fixed records. It lived in bodies, in repeated movements, in remembered routes, in seasonal timing, and in the quiet transfer of experience from older members of a group to younger ones. Human survival depended on this continuity. A child did not need to understand climate in abstract terms to benefit from it. What mattered was that the group had learned, over many seasons, when to move, where to search, how long a place could support life, and what signs in the land suggested safety or danger. This kind of learning is powerful because it turns the past into something usable. It allows the body to act before crisis becomes extreme. It allows effort to be timed, rather than wasted. It allows small groups, living without large stores of protection, to survive in environments that would otherwise seem too uncertain. But this system of learning has one deep condition. It works best when the future resembles the recent past closely enough for experience to remain useful. When that resemblance weakens, learning itself becomes less stable. This is where a rapidly changing, colder world begins to affect not only bodies and landscapes, but memory as a survival tool. Knowledge, passed between generations, is never only information, it is expectation shaped by repetition. A route is remembered because it worked more than once. A season is trusted because its timing held often enough to guide preparation. A place is returned to because the group learned that it could support life under known conditions. If those conditions begin to shift faster than memory can adjust, then inherited knowledge loses some of its reliability. It does not become worthless, but it becomes partial. It continues pointing toward the world as it was recently experienced, while the world itself begins to behave differently. This creates a difficult gap. Older knowledge still carries authority because it was built through real survival, Yet the body now encounters outcomes that no longer fully match that knowledge. For a small human group, this would have been one of the quietest and most serious pressures of all. The problem is not that people suddenly forget what they know. The problem is that what they know no longer guarantees the same return. A place once used successfully may now provide less. A timing once trusted may now arrive too early or too late. The body, which depends on anticipation to reduce effort, is forced into a more uncertain relationship with the wisdom it has inherited. This makes learning more expensive. Instead of reinforcing stable knowledge, each new season may partly revise it. Instead of passing down confident guidance, the group may pass down guidance with more conditions attached, more caution, more awareness that the land no longer answers in the same way every time. That shift matters because human beings survive not only by individual adaptation, but by cumulative learning. The species is strong partly because one generation does not have to begin from nothing. It receives tools, habits, roots, and interpretations shaped by those who lived before. In a relatively stable world, this creates continuity. In a rapidly changing one, continuity becomes harder to preserve. The young must learn from the old, but the old are also confronting a world that has moved beyond some of their own expectations. This does not erase their value. It makes their knowledge harder to apply cleanly. The body then lives in a world where learning is still essential, but less final. Experience must be updated more often, tested more carefully, and held more lightly than before. This would have shaped the human condition deeply. It means survival is no longer guided by memory alone, but by memory under revision. And revision is costly. It takes time, repeated exposure, and the willingness to act within uncertainty. In a colder world where food is less reliable and movement more demanding, those costs are felt directly in the body. Every failed expectation consumes energy. Every delayed correction deepens strain. Over time, this may be one of the clearest ways environmental change enters human life. Not only by altering the land, but by weakening the trust that lets one generation hand the world to the next with confidence. When inherited knowledge begins to lose precision, the process of learning does not stop, but it changes in character. Instead of reinforcing what is already known, each new experience must be weighed more carefully, because it may not fit neatly into existing patterns. A place that once supported life may now do so only under certain conditions. A season that once followed a reliable sequence may now arrive unevenly. The body still learns, but it must learn with greater caution, because the cost of misinterpreting a new pattern is higher. This shifts the balance between confidence and doubt. Confidence allows action to be taken quickly and efficiently. Doubt slows action, requiring more observation, more testing, and more adjustment. In a stable environment, confidence is often rewarded because patterns hold. In an unstable one, confidence can lead to error, while doubt, though protective, consumes time and energy. The human body is therefore placed in a difficult position. It must continue to act, but it cannot rely on either confidence or doubt alone. It must combine them, moving forward while remaining ready to revise what it has just learned. This creates a form of learning that is more tentative. Knowledge is not discarded, but it is held with less certainty. A route may still be used, but with the awareness that it may fail. A place may still be trusted, but only temporarily. A timing may still guide action, but with less assurance that it will align with what the body needs. Over time, this tentative learning reshapes how groups respond to the world. Instead of building long chains of expectation, they may rely more on shorter sequences of observation and response. Decisions become more immediate, more closely tied to what is happening now rather than to what has been consistently true in the past. This is not a loss of intelligence or memory. It is a shift in how those capacities are used under pressure. The body still seeks patterns, but it finds them harder to stabilize. As a result, patterns must be rebuilt more often, and each rebuilding requires effort. This has implications for how knowledge is shared within a group. Teaching becomes less about passing on fixed guidance, and more about conveying how to interpret changing conditions. Younger members may learn not only where to go, but how to recognize when a place is no longer sufficient. They may learn not only when to move, but how to sense when timing has shifted. This kind of learning is more complex because it cannot rely on repetition alone. It must incorporate variability. The body must become attuned not just to patterns, but to changes within patterns. This increases cognitive and physical demand at the same time. More attention must be given to subtle cues in the environment, while the body is already dealing with the strain of cold, hunger, and movement. The cost of attention is often overlooked, but it is real. It requires energy, and it competes with other demands on the body. In a world where energy is limited, the need to constantly interpret and reinterpret the environment adds another layer of pressure. This is how environmental instability reshapes learning at a fundamental level. It does not remove the ability to learn. It changes what learning must do. Instead of consolidating experience into stable guidance, learning becomes a continuous process of adjustment. Each success must be confirmed again. Each failure must be understood quickly enough to avoid repetition. Over time, this can create a more flexible form of knowledge, but one that is also more fragile because it depends on constant updating. The body carries this fragility in its need to act before full certainty is possible. It cannot wait for complete understanding, because survival requires immediate response. It must therefore live with partial knowledge, refining it as it goes. This is the deeper effect of a world that no longer aligns with recent memory. It forces learning to operate without the same foundation of repetition, turning it into an ongoing negotiation between what has been learned and what is still changing. And in that negotiation, the human body remains the place where every decision is tested, where every adjustment is paid for, and where the limits of learning are felt most directly. As this condition continues, learning itself begins to carry a new kind of burden. It is no longer only a way of preserving survival. It becomes a way of coping with the possibility that what has just been learned may not remain true for long. This changes the emotional and practical weight of memory, even if we speak about it cautiously and without projecting modern inner language onto prehistoric people. What can be said is simpler. The value of experience depends on how often experience continues to work. When the world changes slowly, a successful pattern gains strength each time it is repeated. It becomes easier for the body and the group to trust it. But when the world shifts more quickly, repetition loses some of its power. A lesson learned in one sequence of seasons may not hold in the next. A place that has recently become useful may weaken again. A route that seemed restored may fail under slightly different conditions. The body then lives in a more provisional relationship with its own learning. It still depends on memory, because there is no other way to survive, but memory now comes with less certainty that it will be rewarded. This matters because human beings are not only creatures that learn, they are creatures that build continuity through learning. One generation survives partly because the previous one has already paid the cost of discovering what works. If that transfer becomes less stable, the whole rhythm of collective survival changes. Knowledge must still be passed on, but it may now be passed on with greater caution, greater emphasis on signs of change, and greater awareness that no single answer remains reliable across all conditions. In practical terms, this means the group must preserve both memory and flexibility at once. It must remember what has worked while staying ready to abandon or modify that knowledge when the land no longer responds in the same way. That double demand is difficult, because memory encourages confidence while instability requires hesitation. The body carries both. It needs confidence to act before reserves run too low, but it also needs hesitation to avoid trusting patterns that have weakened. This tension may be one of the most important human consequences of a rapidly changing environment. It does not only reshape movement or subsistence, it reshapes the form of knowledge itself. Knowledge becomes more conditional, more dependent on recent feedback, and more vulnerable to being revised again. Over time, this likely alters how the young learn from the old. The lesson is no longer just where to go or when to move, but how to recognize that the answer may shift. That is a more demanding world to learn in. It asks the body to remain alert not only to danger, but to the changing reliability of guidance. And alertness, in a colder and more energy-limited environment, has a cost. More observation means more time before rest. More testing means more movement before certainty. More revision means fewer chances to settle fully into routine. This is why the weakening of inherited certainty should be understood as a bodily pressure, not just an intellectual one. The human organism survives by turning repeated experience into reduced effort. When repeated experience stops reducing effort as effectively, life becomes heavier. More of each day must be spent checking, adjusting, correcting, and preparing for outcomes that may not follow expectation. The environment does not need to become completely unknowable for this to matter. It only needs to become unstable enough that knowledge can no longer harden into dependable rhythm as easily as before. Once that happens, every generation must work harder to maintain continuity. They still inherit the past, but they inherit it in a world that has begun to pull away from it. This may be one of the quietest legacies of the colder return. Not simply that it made life harder in obvious physical terms, but that it weakened the smooth transfer of certainty from one human life to the next. And when that transfer weakens, survival does not stop, but it becomes more expensive, because each generation must spend more of its own body rediscovering what the world will still allow. One of the most misleading ways to imagine this colder phase is as a single dramatic interruption, a sudden blow, after which life immediately became something else. The evidence suggests something more difficult in a human sense. What mattered was not only that conditions changed, but that they remained altered long enough to outlast a moment of emergency. A short shock can be endured differently from a long instability. The body can survive a brief period of extreme strain if recovery follows soon after. It can absorb hunger, cold, and uncertainty for a limited time, when those pressures are part of a cycle that eventually turns back toward relief. But when altered conditions extend across years and generations, the problem changes. Survival is no longer about withstanding one hard season. It becomes about living inside a world that does not quickly return what has been taken. This distinction is central to the human story. A prolonged colder phase would have asked more than endurance from the body. It would have asked the body to reorganize its expectations over time while still functioning under reduced margins. Warmth still had to be maintained, food still had to be found, movement still had to happen. Yet the body could no longer treat these tasks as disruptions from a stable baseline. They became the baseline itself. This is what long instability does. It turns emergency into routine, and routine hardship is often more reshaping than brief catastrophe, because it enters every cycle of life: sleep, rest, movement, care of the young, use of space, and transfer of knowledge. For small human groups, a prolonged shift would have meant that no single successful season was enough to restore confidence. Even if one year brought slightly better conditions, the larger uncertainty remained. Places could not be trusted fully again just because they worked once. Routes could not be assumed reliable because they had recently improved. The body would continue learning, but it would do so in shorter intervals, with less confidence that present success would continue into the near future. Over time, this alters not only action but tempo. Life becomes organized around repeated caution. Recovery becomes more partial because no full release from uncertainty arrives. The body can rest, but not as deeply. It can regain strength, but not with the same confidence that strength will be enough for what follows. In this way, a longer, unstable period affects the organism differently from a brief crisis. It does not simply wound, it recalibrates. It lowers the level at which the body comes to operate comfortably, and it teaches the group to live with less certainty as a normal condition rather than as an exception. This prolonged state would also have mattered at the scale of generations. A child born into such a world would not remember the earlier pattern clearly, if at all. Older members might carry memories of conditions that no longer held, while younger ones learned from within the altered environment itself. That creates a subtle change in human continuity. The group is no longer simply trying to recover what was lost. It is trying to decide whether recovery is even the right expectation. The body, again, stands at the center of this. It does not know historical periods. It knows what effort now costs, how much warmth now requires, how rarely food now returns, and how often movement must now be repeated. If those measures remain difficult for long enough, they cease to feel temporary. They become the practical truth of life. This may be one of the deepest consequences of a world that did not stabilize quickly. It forced humans not merely to survive a disruption, but to inhabit uncertainty for long enough that uncertainty itself became part of the structure of being human in that time. That is a quieter burden than sudden catastrophe, but in many ways a heavier one. A sudden event can pass, A prolonged condition settles into the body, the group, and the landscape at once, until no part of life remains untouched by the need to keep adapting, without clear assurance that adaptation will soon become easier. As time extends under these altered conditions, the human body begins to treat what was once unusual as ordinary. This is not because the strain has disappeared, but because the organism adjusts its expectations downward to match what is consistently available. Warmth is still difficult to maintain, but the body becomes accustomed to managing within that difficulty. Food remains uneven, but the body learns to operate with less reliable intake as a normal state, rather than as a temporary disruption. Movement continues to demand effort, but that effort becomes part of the daily pattern rather than an exception that can be avoided. This adjustment is not a full solution. It is a recalibration. The body shifts its sense of what is typical, and in doing so, it allows life to continue under conditions that would otherwise feel constantly abnormal. Yet this recalibration carries a cost. What was once considered adequate recovery may now fall short. What was once a sign of warning may become part of the background. The body becomes more tolerant of strain, but tolerance does not remove strain. It only changes how strain is perceived and managed. This is one of the quieter ways prolonged instability reshapes human life. It does not always appear as worsening difficulty over time. It can appear as a steady state that is simply harder than what came before. The body adapts to that state by narrowing its expectations, conserving where it can, and continuing to function within reduced margins. For small groups, this shift would have influenced how decisions were made across seasons. Instead of expecting a clear return to easier conditions, the group may begin to plan within a framework where difficulty is assumed. Movement may be timed more conservatively. Rest may be taken wherever it is possible rather than where it is ideal. Resources may be used more carefully because replacement is uncertain. These are not dramatic changes in isolation, but together they shape a different rhythm of life. The environment no longer provides strong signals that guide long-term planning with confidence. It provides weaker signals that must be interpreted in the short term. This short-term orientation does not mean that humans stop thinking ahead. It means that looking ahead carries less certainty, and therefore decisions must be revisited more often. Over generations, this can influence how knowledge is structured. Instead of emphasizing fixed sequences, learning may emphasize flexibility within limits. Younger members of the group may come to understand that conditions shift and that no single pattern can be trusted fully. This does not remove the value of memory, but it changes its role. Memory becomes a guide that must always be checked against the present, rather than a stable map that can be followed with confidence. The body carries this shift in a practical way. It becomes more attuned to immediate feedback, more responsive to small changes in the environment, and more cautious about extending effort based solely on past success. This responsiveness is a form of adaptation, but it also requires sustained attention. The organism must remain alert to variations that might once have been ignored, because patterns were stronger. Attention, like movement and heat, has a cost. It draws on energy and time. In a world where both are limited, the need to maintain heightened awareness adds another layer of demand. Over time, this creates a life that is organized less around stable cycles and more around continuous adjustment. Each day must be read in its own terms. Each place must be evaluated again. Each decision must balance what is known with what is uncertain. This is not a failure of human adaptation. It is a different form of adaptation, one shaped by persistence of instability rather than by return to balance. Yet it means that the body never fully settles into ease. It continues to function, to endure, to learn, but always within a world that asks more from it than before and offers less in return. And when such conditions last long enough, they do not feel temporary. They become the lived structure of human existence in that time, shaping not only survival but the very sense of what life normally demands. When instability lasts across many years, perhaps across the span of several human lives, it begins to do something that a brief crisis cannot do. It changes the scale at which people imagine recovery. In a short disruption, the body and the group can endure with the expectation that relief will eventually arrive and restore the old balance. But when relief does not come clearly, or comes only in fragments, the meaning of recovery itself begins to shift. Recovery is no longer a return to what once was. It becomes the ability to remain functional within altered conditions. This is a major change in the human condition, because it means the group is no longer living toward restoration. It is living toward maintenance. The body still seeks warmth, food, rest, and usable ground, but now these are pursued not as parts of a familiar cycle that will soon stabilize, but as elements of a world where instability has become ordinary enough to shape expectation. That does not make the world easier, it makes the burden quieter and more enduring. The body stops treating strain as an interruption and starts carrying it as part of daily structure. This is how long periods of environmental pressure leave deeper marks than single shocks. They do not only test resilience, they redefine what resilience must mean. For small human groups, this would have changed how confidence was distributed through time. A good stretch of days might still matter, but it could no longer erase the larger uncertainty. A useful place might still offer temporary support, but that support would be understood as conditional. A successful movement might restore strength briefly, yet not prove that the next movement would do the same. Over time, the group would learn to hold success more lightly. This is not pessimism in a modern emotional sense. It is a practical response to a world that no longer repeats itself clearly enough to justify full trust. The body participates in this lesson directly. It learns that effort must often be spent without complete assurance of return. It learns that rest may be partial, that food may arrive unevenly, and that places may remain usable only for shorter spans than before. These lessons would not be spoken as theory. They would be carried in movement, pacing, timing, and caution. That is why prolonged instability matters so much. It enters not just single decisions, but the entire rhythm through which humans live. Even the transfer of knowledge between generations changes under these conditions. Older members may remember other rhythms, but younger ones grow into the altered rhythm itself. This creates a world in which continuity still exists, yet its content has shifted. The group is no longer trying simply to preserve an older way of matching body to landscape. It is trying to build continuity inside uncertainty. That is a harder task. It requires enough memory to avoid beginning from nothing, but also enough flexibility to accept that memory will not always lead to the same result. In bodily terms, this means every generation may need to spend more effort than before just to establish a workable sense of normal life. And that effort is costly when cold, hunger, and movement already consume so much. This is perhaps the deepest consequence of a world that did not stabilize quickly. It forced human beings to live long enough inside altered conditions that change itself became part of the inherited environment. The body did not merely survive one frozen turn. It had to continue making life within a reality that kept asking for adjustment without promising quick relief. In that sense, the colder phase was not only an event in climate, it was a prolonged pressure on the human habit of expecting the world to become readable again soon. When that expectation weakens, life becomes more provisional, more cautious, and more dependent on short-term balance rather than long-term trust. The body can endure such a world, and human beings clearly did. But endurance under those terms is not simple strength. It is the slow acceptance that survival may now depend less on waiting for the world to return, and more on learning how to remain human inside a world that has stopped returning easily. What remains after such a period may not be a memory in any direct sense, yet it can still leave a legacy in the human condition. Not a conscious memory passed intact across thousands of years, and not a simple instinct that can be cleanly traced to one event, but a deeper pattern in how human life repeatedly forms around uncertainty. When the environment becomes difficult, humans do not merely endure it as isolated bodies. They reorganize their rhythms, narrow their expectations, depend more heavily on one another, and learn to live inside conditions that do not offer quick reassurance. This is one reason periods like this matter even now. Their significance does not rest only in what happened in climate history, but in what they reveal about the kind of creature the human being has always been. The human body is not a machine built for stable comfort. It is a living system shaped through long exposure to variation, interruption, and incomplete control. Yet the story told across these earlier parts has also shown something more delicate. Humans are not built for unlimited disruption either. They require patterns, even if imperfect ones. They require enough repetition in the world for memory to remain useful, for learning to accumulate, and for effort to produce results often enough that life can continue without collapsing into constant emergency. A colder return such as this matters because it pressed directly on that requirement. It did not merely lower temperature, it weakened continuity. It asked the body to keep functioning while many of the rhythms that once linked expectation to outcome had become less dependable. This may be one of the quiet truths still relevant to human life. People often imagine survival as something dramatic, a matter of singular courage in the face of extreme events. But most survival, both then and now, happens in a slower register. It is made of repeated adjustment, partial recovery, provisional trust, and the ability to continue organizing life when the world no longer answers clearly. In that sense, the legacy of such a period may lie less in any one inherited trait than in the broader human tendency to seek stability while expecting instability to return. The body still searches for warmth, rhythm, and recognizable order, yet human societies also carry a long familiarity with the fact that these things can weaken. This double condition may be part of what makes humans both inventive and restless. We build patterns, yet rarely assume they are permanent. We depend on place, yet remain capable of leaving it. We pass down knowledge, yet hold some part of that knowledge ready to be revised when the world shifts again. None of this should be reduced to a simple claim that one climatic episode created modern human psychology. The evidence does not permit such certainty, and the past is never so narrow. But it is reasonable to say that episodes of prolonged instability reveal recurring features of the human condition with unusual clarity. They show that survival is collective, that the body depends on more than strength, and that one of the greatest human burdens is to remain teachable, even when the world stops teaching in familiar ways. This is perhaps the beginning of the final reflection. The people who lived through that colder turn did not know they were inhabiting a named period in climate history. They knew only the body, the land, the group, and the growing difficulty of matching one to the other. Yet from that distance, something enduring becomes visible. Human beings are creatures of pattern, but never guaranteed pattern. We need continuity, but we are often formed by interruption. And perhaps that is why this story still reaches forward. It is not only about a world that suddenly froze. It is about what happens whenever human life must continue without the comfort of believing that the world will soon become simple again. If there is a lasting lesson in this story, it may be that human life has never depended on certainty as much as it has depended on the ability to keep forming meaning when certainty weakens. The body is always searching for rhythm. It wants enough continuity to know when to rest, when to move, when to conserve warmth, and when effort is likely to be rewarded. But the deeper history of our species suggests that this search has often unfolded in a world that only partly cooperates. The colder return explored in this video makes that truth unusually visible. It shows that one of the heaviest burdens a human body can carry is not only hunger or cold, but the repeated need to act without full reassurance that action will work. And yet that burden is also where a great deal of human value appears. Not heroic value in a dramatic sense, but quieter value. The value of continuing to coordinate with others when no one can fully promise safety. The value of preserving knowledge even when knowledge must be revised. The value of remaining responsive to the world without expecting the world to become simple. These are not small things. They are among the deepest forms of endurance our species has practiced. When environments shift too quickly, the body reveals its limits. It cannot adapt infinitely. It cannot absorb endless uncertainty without cost. It needs warmth, food, rest, and usable time. It needs enough pattern in the world for memory to remain more than guesswork. But this story has also shown something equally important. Human beings do not survive only by matching the world perfectly. They survive by rebuilding partial stability again and again, even when the match is incomplete. A place may no longer be fully dependable, yet people still find a way to use it for a time. A route may no longer guarantee success, yet it still becomes part of the next attempt. A body may no longer recover as fully as before, yet it continues to move, to learn, and to remain tied to others. This repeated rebuilding may be one of the most human things in the world. It does not eliminate suffering, and it does not guarantee victory over every change. But it creates continuity, where continuity is no longer freely given. That may be why this ancient climate story still matters now. Not because our world is the same as theirs, and not because one event in the deep past explains all that followed, but because it reminds us what the human organism has always needed and what it has always feared. It needs a world that can be read well enough to live in. It fears the moment when reading becomes harder than before. And still, between those two conditions, it continues. It makes patterns from fragments. It creates shared life inside uncertainty. It learns to move without ever fully escaping fragility. Perhaps this is the more educational meaning left behind by a world that seemed to freeze again. Human beings are not simply creatures that conquer nature, and not simply creatures crushed by it. We are creatures that negotiate with it, often imperfectly, often under strain, and often without final answers. The people living through that colder phase likely never knew they were part of a story that would be studied thousands of years later. They only knew that the land had become harder to trust, that the body had to pay more for survival, and that life had to keep being organized inside those new terms. From that quiet reality comes a thought worth carrying forward. Much of what makes humans human may not lie in avoiding uncertainty, but in remaining capable of care, memory, adjustment, and shared effort when uncertainty does not leave. And once we see that, the story becomes larger than one ancient climatic reversal. It becomes a reflection on the fragile skill our species has practiced for a very long time. Living in a world that does not always return to us the stability we hoped for, and still trying to become readable to one another within it. At the end of this long movement through cold, uncertainty, and adaptation, what remains is not a clear answer, but a quieter recognition. The world that seemed to shift so abruptly did not leave behind a single lesson that could be carried forward unchanged. Instead, it revealed something about the nature of human life that does not belong to one time alone. Human beings live in relationship with patterns, but those patterns are never guaranteed. The body seeks rhythm because rhythm reduces effort, makes survival more efficient, and allows knowledge to accumulate into something stable. Yet again and again, across deep time, that rhythm has been interrupted. Not always in the same way, not always at the same scale, but often enough that interruption itself becomes part of what it means to be human. The people who lived through that colder return did not stand outside their world and observe it as history. They moved within it, felt it through hunger, cold, fatigue, and the changing usefulness of the land. They adjusted where they could, endured where they had to, and continued without knowing how long the instability would last. That is perhaps the most honest way to understand their experience. Not as a story with a clear beginning, middle, and resolution, but as a prolonged negotiation between body and environment, where each day required enough alignment to continue into the next. And that negotiation never becomes perfect. Even in more stable times, the human body does not control the world. It responds to it, reads it, and tries to stay within its shifting boundaries. What this colder phase shows is what happens when those boundaries become harder to see. The body does not stop needing them. It simply has to live with less certainty about where they are. This is where the story turns gently back toward the present, not to compare directly, but to reflect. The human organism that exists now is still shaped by long exposure to worlds that did not always behave in stable ways. It still depends on cooperation, on shared knowledge, on the ability to adjust when patterns weaken. It still carries limits, even if those limits are often hidden by the structures of modern life. And perhaps most importantly, it still carries the same quiet requirement, to remain capable of forming meaning and coordination even when the environment does not offer easy reassurance. The ancient cold does not need to be remembered consciously to matter. It matters because it is one example among many of how human life has been shaped at its edges, where comfort fades and adaptation becomes necessary. In those spaces, something essential becomes visible, not a dramatic triumph, and not a simple failure, but a continued effort to remain human under conditions that do not guarantee ease. And so the story does not end with a conclusion that closes the question. It returns instead to the same uncertainty that began it. A world changed, and people continued within it. They adjusted, endured, reorganized, and passed something forward, even if that something was no longer as stable as before. The details of their lives remain partly hidden, but the outline is enough to suggest that survival was never about certainty. It was about maintaining enough connection between body, group, and environment to continue, even when that connection became harder to hold. And perhaps that is the final thought to rest with. If the world can change faster than memory can follow, if patterns can weaken before new ones form, then what does it mean to live well inside that uncertainty? And how much of what we call human today is still shaped by learning to continue when the world does not return to us as we expect?